Okay.
Hello, my fellow Westorians. Am I in robot voice today? Everyone's calling me Robot Aziz and looking forward to hearing Robot Aziz, but I'm not sure Robot Aziz is here today. He just comes when he feels like it. We have no control over Robot Aziz. He disobeys his masters and his core function. Sounding okay?
I'm still waiting.
Waiting for feedback. Yeah, let's see what people say. No one has said anything. Maybe they can't hear it. Okay, everyone says yes. Cool, okay then. In that case, diddly diddly doo. Sir Criston drew his longsword from its scabbard. As you will it. We can begin here, the four of us. One of me against the three of you. Will that be enough to make a fight of it? Fire and blood.
Finally, he drew his sword. Sansa heard someone gasp. Sir Boros and Sir Marin moved forward to confront him, but Sir Barristan froze them in place with a look that dripped contempt. Have no fears, sirs. Your king is safe. No thanks to you. Even now, I could cut through the five of you as easy as a dagger cuts cheese. A Game of Thrones, Sansa 5.
Yeah, welcome back, everybody, my fellow Westorians. We are here with another Tuesday live stream. We have these from time to time when we have a topic prepared. We like to have guests whenever possible as well. And with that in mind, with me as always is Ashaya. But today we have a special guest whose voice you've already heard reading that second quote, Jeff Hartline, a.k.a. Brynden Beefish. Welcome back to History of Westeros, Jeff.
Hey, everybody. It's funny. Like, remember we started this like years ago, 7 years ago. No, we were doing the Battle of Ice podcast.
That's right.
Way back then when we were sure the Winds of Winter was coming out in 2014. and of course it did. And so all of our theories we were talking about in those early live streams, I guess they weren't even live streams. They were live streams.
Those were,
all those theories they've come true now, which has been nice to have all that confirmation that our Battle of Ice theories are all 100% accurate. It's awesome. It's great. It's good stuff. And good.
I was going to say, it's so mean for you to tease everybody about how we have copies of The Winds of Winter and nobody else does. But that's because you're George R. R. Martin, I think.
That's true.
That rumor is becoming closer and closer to confirmed.
Oh, yeah, you can tell as I get older and my stubble starts to go gray. And, I'll become George R. R. Martin slowly and surely as time goes on. But yeah, as East was saying, I'm Jeff. I'm better known as Brynden Beefish. I have a podcast called the Not a Cast Podcast. It's a podcast that I co-host with Emmett Booth, better known as Poor Quentin, in which we go through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. And currently we are lollygagging behind you all, you guys are in a sprint on the way to the end of A Storm of Swords. We are way back in Catelyn's third chapter in A Clash of Kings, the chapter we just recorded last night. And it's a pleasure coming back on. It was nice seeing you a couple weeks ago too, when I was down your way in the American South.
That's right. We got to hang out in person and have some dinner, all of us here, right before Sean and Rita moved to, Rita already lived in Colorado, but before Sean moved with Rita to Colorado. The American South, yeah. Good old Atlanta.
Y'all.
Good old Hotlanta. No, we don't call it Hotlanta, everybody. Only people outside of Atlanta call it Hotlanta. But yeah, it's so cool to have you on, and this is a topic we've wanted to do for a while. This is a great theory / comparison that's emerged over, I guess it's not something that came out right away after A Dance with Dragons, partly because so much of it depends on the side material, like The World of Ice and Fire and Blood, that's helped these comparisons come together. But we're not just focusing on the parallels between the two. That's a big part of it. We're going to explore them individually as well. That's a part of it. Obviously, even when there's characters that have a lot in common, they have plenty that isn't in common. So we're going to talk about things that are separate from them, things that are different, as well as things that are similar. And because we know Cole's life all the way through, a big question, of course, is, does Cole's endgame predict Barristan's? So we're going to think about that as well. And if we have time, we're going to have a bonus comparison of Barristan and Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, because there's a lot to do with that. There's a lot of meat on those bones. And if we don't have time for it, we'll do that some other time. So a couple of quick announcements. We've got Dance of the Dragons Part 2 is out. That's with Radio Westeros. I bring that up because, of course, it is relevant to Criston Cole. He's a big part of that. And Jeff, you guys are doing Monday streams now, at least for the time being. Is that right?
We are, yeah, with the current quarantine happening around the world, but especially in many parts of the United States, and hopefully all of the parts of the United States soon enough. We are doing a weekly stream for all of our episodes as long as the quarantine lasts. So if you guys enjoy these live streams. We're basically, as we often say in the other cast, we're basically the calling back to our progenitors, our fathers, like in the fandom, namely yourself, doing live streams 7-8 years ago, and we're doing it now in 2020. You know, you've set the standard, and now we have to attempt to attain and achieve that standard, because you guys are doing like almost 1 to 2 live streams a week, and now we're on the catch up again. We're still lollygagging behind, but yeah, so we're doing these episodes weekly now as a live cast, and for the foreseeable future, hopefully not too long, and we'll see how it goes. But we're really enjoying it so far.
Well,
we just did a Catelyn 3 last night.
Yeah, you guys were great. I was on that for a while. You're too kind. You guys are fantastic. Your analysis is different, but every bit as good in my opinion. And I think if anybody who hasn't checked them out,
to barely being able to articulate anything.
You can see that clearly why I wouldn't be, if I can't even speak in complete sentences, then then you can see why maybe it's time to check out someone else.
No.
But we are, speaking of during the quarantine, we have our Friday game streams going. We're also going to do them on Wednesday. Sometimes they'll be a little different. We've got a few surprises planned there, but that's just a little fun thing that we can keep recurring to hang out with everybody. And while people are spending more time at home. And finally, I finished Jenny's song. Yay! Yes. It's been produced. So the minute this stream ends, I'll be uploading it to Patreon and SoundCloud and sharing it around social media. Thanks to our Bengineer for editing it and putting it together. I did the recording on Sunday with a lot of help from Ashea. And super chat from Nina says, hey, want to send some love even if I can't stick around today. We'll appreciate that, Nina. We will look forward to your takes after hearing it. All right. So we'll start with some surface level comparisons just to set the stage, just to show you all, maybe some of you aren't familiar with just how many similarities there are between these two characters. And then we'll get further deep into these comparisons with more detail. Let's just lay this out to start off with. Appearance-wise, Cole they both have pale eyes. Cole's are green, Barristan's are blue. One has light hair, one has dark hair. Maybe that's meant to be kind of a yin-yang thing, or maybe it's just a coincidence. They were both pretty much the best knight of their generation, incredible tournament champion. They're both from the Marches. They're both the sons of, from that area, the Dornish Marches in the Stormlands. Criston Cole was born at Blackhaven, and Barristan got his nickname, the Bold, at a tournament at Blackhaven. Both of them were named to the Kingsguard exactly at age 23. Both were Lord Commander twice, Cole for Viserys and then Aegon II, and then Barristan for Robert and Dany. And now, of course, Barristan was in the Kingsguard before Robert, but he wasn't Kingsguard before Robert. One has the nickname the Kingmaker, one the Kingbreaker. Hand of the King, hand of the Queen. Cole rules his hand while Aegon II is badly hurt and in hiding. Kind of similar to Barristan ruling while Dany is missing on Drogon after Daznak's pit, I guess you could say. Especially given the rumors of what happened to Dany, which she's all burned up, and which is what happened to Aegon II. Septon Eustace says Cole offered to run off with Rhaenyra across the Narrow Sea, pledging his sword to a merchant prince, versus Barristan signing up for Dany via Illyria, who's a merchant prince of sorts. So that's, that's sort of similar. Now we get into some of the personality aspects that are maybe a little where some of these comparisons can really get a little more meaty. Cole, we have this whole thing about Cole rejecting Rhaenyra romantically. Now, there's not going to be any kind of romance between Barristan and Dany. The age gap is too big, and Dany's not going to be interested. Barristan isn't going to think that that's just not happening. But you had some thoughts on where some of this might have landed elsewhere.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and one of the great things that George did in Dance of Dragons is that he had Barristan as a POV, introduced him as a point of view character, and the reason why is complicated, but one of the big reasons is that he ended up being the sword, literally, that sliced the Barony's knot that he was working at and entangling throughout the period from 2009 onwards to about 2011. So in Barristan's internal monologue and his thoughts, he has this sort of fascination, shall we say, with a character by the name of Ashara Dane. I don't know, have you guys ever heard of her? I mean,
first time I've heard of her. No, yeah,
first time, yeah, same for me. But yeah, so I was sort of thinking that of Barristan in Selmy admiring Ashara from afar, but never having the guts to do anything with Ashara looking to quote unquote Chad Stark. It's a Stark we don't know whose identity it is.
Chad Stark.
So he's very like he seems upset about this and upset about his inability to actually approach Ashara and introduce some romance with her. And I'm just going to throw this out here. I'm not saying this is something that I believe in necessarily, because I like you. I don't think there's going to be any actual romance between Daenerys and Barristan Selmy, but there is something strange about the way that Barristan is regarding Dany when in his POV chapters. In the Kingbreak, for instance, he thinks sometimes when the queen looked at him, he felt as if he were looking at Ashara's daughter. And then there's an ellipses right after that, ... And you're like, what is Barristan actually going with there? And maybe that is emphasizing that Barristan is feeling something a little bit more than chaste courtly love for Dany. And I was thinking about this in comparison to another character that you may have heard of called Littlefinger, and another one called Sansa Stark.
Why do you keep bringing up these characters I've never heard of? I mean,
I know, it's weird. It's in one of the world books, I think. But no, I think one of the Suspect Martins, anyways. But I do think about Littlefinger treating Sansa and like calling her like Cat's daughter and having this kind of weird relationship with Sansa Stark, where George has talked about that sometimes Littlefinger looks at Sansa and he sees his own daughter. Sometimes he looks at her and sees a younger version of Catelyn Tully, and sometimes he looks at her and sees a grown-up version of Catelyn Tully too. So it's kind of this kind of weird relationship. Again, I'm not saying that Barristan is necessarily thinking that, but I am saying that it was possibly included in the narrative to kind of lead us as readers to question Barristan's relationship to Daenerys and how he actually feels about her.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it also is echoes of what's going on with Jorah Mormont, who's obviously a big part of this same arc with Dany and Barristan, which is that, you know, the way she finds out that he's into her is him saying, "Oh yeah, my ex-wife Lynesse looked like you," which is kind of similar to this take from Barristan, is you talking about someone that you were into and then mention that someone else who looks just like that person, and you're like, okay, so you're into that person too? Is that what you're saying? Because they're so similar. Yeah, so that's a really good catch. I hadn't thought of that, and I think there's something to do there as well. But of course, the point with Criston Cole is we don't know, and that's something we're going to get into, whether Criston approached Rhaenyra or Rhaenyra approached Criston and how that all went. There's disputed information there, and that's something that we are not going to have in A Song of Ice and Fire because we have these people's point of views. We're going to know pretty sure, I think, how they feel about each other, with some exceptions. I mean, we're not going to ever get inside Jorah's head, but we're not too terribly worried about doing that. But Barristan, you know, we're going to get more from him, and we may get some more information. And, you know, maybe related to that is Barristan not liking Daario, but that's not saying much, right?
Well, I mean, there's the idea that Criston Cole in the first meeting where, you know, the first bloodletting occurs in the Dance of the Dragons, where he kind of like Criston Cole echoes Barristan's prudish view on the Queen's lover, declaring that they will turn the Red Keep into a brothel. No man's daughter will be safe, nor any man's wife, even the boys. We know what Laenor was. I mean, that's the Laenor-Daario comparison I'm not saying is firm, but it is at least something that we can look as potential link between these two characters and their regard for the Queen's love interest, so to speak.
I think you could make a pretty strong comparison between Daario and Daemon. I mean, as far as their kind of brutal, bloody personalities and just being real kind of, you know, arrogant about their ability, you know, things like that, maybe, and being kind of handsome. Well, I don't think Daario, a lot of people don't think Dario's handsome, but Dany clearly does.
Gold tooth, baby.
Yeah, gold tooth. So, yeah, he's got that grill going. Now, so Cole also did not like Rhaenyra's lover, Breakbone. So when they had their falling out for whatever reason, he really seemed to make a special example out of Broken Bones, as his nickname became after Cole was through with him. I mean, the tournaments back then must have been a little different, I swear. Cole fights Daemon Targaryen in a tournament, and Daemon's apparently wielding Dark Sister in a tournament. Like, what is that? And then you have Cole beating him despite that with using his Morningstar to knock the sword from his hand. And then he takes that same Morningstar and beats Rhaenyra's lover with it and breaks several of his bones. So this guy was a big deal in a fight. And that's also true with Barristan, although Barristan may be a little more honorable. But this is a thing we need to be keeping aware of the whole time. What we know about Criston Cole comes through us through history. That's why I'm making this point about Barristan and Dany and POVs. We have this insight into their personality that we will never have for Criston Cole. And given all the disputed information, when we finish going through Criston Cole's life, we're going to look at it and try to make a case that he was misunderstood. I don't know if we'll be able to sell that, but we're going to try.
I mean, I think you make a great point. I mean, I think we have Barristan's point of view, which, interestingly enough, normally when characters get a point of view, they become more sympathetic. You know, Jaime Lannister being probably the biggest example. When you get his point of view in A Storm of Swords, instead of him being an out-and-out villain, we start to understand and sympathize with him. And there's this idea in the fandom, which I don't necessarily agree with, that Jaime's on a redemption arc. Interestingly, for Barristan, it's kind of a little bit different. When we get his point of view, he becomes a little bit less noble and virtuous than he is. I do think that he has the honor going for him, but that honor for the sake of some of the royals that he ends up supporting, ends up defending, does kind of lend itself to some questions of moral ambiguity that is inherent in Barristan's characterization before we get his point of view chapters in Dance of Dragons, but really becomes clear afterwards. And so I love this idea of thinking about Criston Cole as being kind of filtered through these maester or dwarf perspectives, or, you know, dwarf jouster, whatever Mushroom is. I can't remember. Mushroom was the court jester. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
Yes.
And so we have this biased point of views coming forward. But if he had his point of view, would he come across more like Barristan, more like Jaime? Who's this guy actually underneath of all of the layers of history and bias that George is embedding into Fire and Blood and the world of Ice and Fire?
It's a great take, and it's something really important in the real world. You have all these people that history remembers them a certain way, and if we actually knew those people, you got to figure at least some of them would be a lot different than the way they were represented in history. At least some of them, you know, that's got to be the case for some people. So we'll keep looking at that as we go through here and see if we can find some other examples of that. I've got a few prepared. Another maybe example here: Criston Cole hated and killed Joffrey Lonmouth in a tournament. Again, this guy just using tournaments to just take out his people he doesn't like. These aren't political enemies; these are just people he doesn't like. And interestingly, Barristan was sacked by Joffrey Baratheon now, and so I don't know if that's a stretch, but I thought that was kind of cool. And the result of that is interesting. You have Cole being named Alicent's Sworn Shield right after that, as well as being named Rhaenyra's Sworn Shield well before that. And Barristan goes to join Daenerys right after being sacked by Joffrey. So right after these Joffrey incidents, Barristan and Cole switched sides. So, or at least confirmed their side switching. They had already kind of left the other side. So, and then another one, thinking of Jorah here, Barristan, what does Barristan do? One of his famous moves when he comes on with Dany's team is he is probably the biggest reason Jorah was removed from council, by spilling the secrets of his past that proved he was acting as a traitor at first against Daenerys. And what does Criston Cole do the minute the Dance of the Dragons breaks out? He removes Lyman Beesbury from council. Maybe kills him, maybe throws him in jail. I don't know. We're not sure. And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. If Criston Cole kills Beesbury just right there in council, that's crappy. Like that's dishonorable. That's scummy. But if he actually threw him in jail, which was what one of the sources says, then that's still kind of scummy, but it's not even close to as bad, right? Like that's way better. So you got to give him a little bit of some leeway there. Of course, they both disobeyed the king's final will. That's a really big one. That's Barristan just kind of went along with it. He sort of protested, but when Cersei tore the will up, he just okay. And go ahead.
Interestingly, too, for Barristan, kind of in that same kind of comparative vein, Dany, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but Dany makes a very firm declaration right before Daznak's pit that she does not want to treat with the Tyrant Prince, that she's not going to allow the Tyrant Prince to take control of Westeros. And Barristan is standing right there, literally right there next to Dany, because he's the one that brings the information to Dany. And then what happens in Barristan's final chapter of Dance with Dragons? Barristan's like, yeah, we'll give the Tyrant Prince Pentos as long as you betray Yunkai on our behalf. So we have another part where the Queen's will is being stated will, because Barristan's right there. He doesn't have any excuse, is being subverted in order to gain a short-term advantage for probably a long-term pain in the ass for Dany's side come the Winds of Winter.
Yep. And Barristan has kind of become, and all throughout this, Barristan is thinking how he doesn't like this. He doesn't want to do any of this. He's just out of depth. I can seriously picture Criston Cole feeling similar. Like, this is not where I got it. He has to do it because it's his duty, but he knows he's not good at it. He knows he hates it. I could kind of see Cole being similar. I mean, he's not really a politician. He's when they named him Hand, which we'll get a little later, he just wanted to just start he's like, campaign, let's go, war, fighting, which is kind of Barristan's attitude. On the personality side, there's a good chance they're both virgins. Now, that's not to make fun of them by any means. It's just a statement on the kind of person they are and the life they've led and their perspective, which is, it goes a long way towards explaining maybe why they're both so chaste. And if Cole is the one that rejected Rhaenyra, that was horrified by her coming on to him, this would really fit with that, because he would be, I don't know what to do. I thought of you as like a daughter figure. It could explain why he turned against her so hard. Of course, her rejecting him would also explain that. So, but either way, that's not a relationship that happened. And Barristan Selmy clearly, not clearly, but he joined the Kingsguard early, was a knight pretty early. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that that's, how do you feel about this in general?
I think it's clear that Barristan Selmy is very much like Aerys Oakheart, where Aerys Oakheart in Ariane's chapters is talking about, oh, he was very experienced in the bedroom before he became a Kingsguard. Absolutely. He was all about that. And then Ariane's like, but you're not very good, so probably not. Right? That's the kind of perspective I get about Barristan and his... And whether he was a virgin. I absolutely think that he was a virgin. I do agree, too, that Criston Cole was likely one as well. And I was thinking about this too, kind of on the overarching side of things. You know, Criston Cole turns against his rightful queen. I have it in italics here, so I'm not making a value judgment necessarily, although Rhaenyra was technically right. And Barristan, if he does turn Cloak, if he does turn Cloak against Daenerys Targaryen, will also be turning against his rightful queen in favor of a man. And Criston Cole makes this point in Fire and Blood where he talks about this idea that the Andal customs place a son before a daughter. And that is likely, if Barristan ends up turning Cloak in the Winds of Winter, that is likely going to be something that is going to influence Barristan's decision, because if he comes to believe that young Grift, aka Aegon VI, probably not, is actually the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, he would be next in line ahead of Daenerys Targaryen. So that's a potential place where these two men could be intersecting in terms of their storylines, at least in terms of the potential turn cloaking for Barristan, their definite turn cloaking in the form of Criston Cole. But again, for Criston, it's very ambiguous because there's multiple reasons given why he actually turns cloak against Rhaenyra, which we will talk about more in depth later on.
Absolutely. And of course, keeping in mind that, as always, all these reasons are given are uncertain. So that's something we're battling with here. But that makes sense too, because when you study history, you never have complete answers, and so George is trying to replicate that real world situation of uncertainty with historical sources. And I think he does a pretty good job of it. He's certainly fun.
He is fun.
Yeah, right. And Mushroom is fun. Septon Eustace is, well, he's not as fun, but he's interesting. Gildane is, well, Gildane is very opinionated, but he's also interesting. And yeah, so here's one that's very much the opposite, though, that I think is interesting. Maybe shed some light on their character, because as much as Barristan and Cole have a lot of plot arc similarity, possibly even more if Barristan goes the route of Cole and switches sides for young Griff. And but in terms of their disposition towards violence and things like that, that might be different. Now, Barristan very notably refuses to assassinate Dany. He takes Ned Stark's side on that. Good for him. And it's a great shining moment that one of the first things we learn about him. So right away, we're pretty predisposed to like Barristan. On the other hand, Criston Cole, we're predisposed to there's not much to like about him right away, and or later, really, other than him being very interesting and an interesting character as far as storytelling goes. But he does try to assassinate Rhaenyra, and that's using shady means. So that's potentially a pretty big difference there.
Yeah, I totally see that. And I think that does speak to this kind of consistent theme in both the stories of Dany and Rhaenyra, and that, Dany and Rhaenyra's inner circle is constantly, in both of their minds, betraying them, right? And this leads to paranoia on the form of both Daenerys and especially Rhaenyra. Dany is not going mad, but she's having a certain degree of paranoia after all the shit that she's gone through in her arc so far, in A Song of Ice and Fire, and that has led to some kind of violent consequences in Dany's story, but especially a lot of violent consequences in Rhaenyra's story in Fire and Blood. Now, the interesting thing is that the turn piece here is that, as you were saying, Criston Cole attempts to actually assassinate Daenerys Targaryen, and Criston Cole attempts to assassinate Rhaenyra Targaryen, and that leads to more of her paranoia coming out. Whereas I think it's more likely that Barristan's turn is likely going to be motivated by the paranoia. So it's kind of a chicken and egg sort of thing. Is the paranoia being inspired by the actions of a character like Barristan Selmy, or is the turn cloaking being inspired by the paranoia that Daenerys Targaryen might be exhibiting come the Winds of Winter?
Great point. Yeah, and of course, there's always the Barristan's inner monologue of him going to serve the true king/queen. If he believes that young Griff is truly the son of Rhaegar, then that's the true king in his mind. He knew Rhaegar. He would come first. So that would be a conundrum for him. It could be seen as treason, and the history books could say he turned his cloak, but it would be at least somewhat consistent with how he's laid out his own sense of honor ahead of time. So, and that's where we're getting into this whole history can be unkind to people who make tough decisions because the history doesn't record all the nuance with that decision. So yeah, let's talk a little more about Criston Cole specifically and build up his history and then lay that out and then move on to Barristan himself. So there's less about Cole because of course we don't have his POVs, but there's still a lot here. Like I said, he's from house. He's a steward house. House Cole was stewards to the Dondarrions of Blackhaven, and that's kind of like House Poole for the Starks, Brian Poole and those guys. The Tyrells used to be a steward house, but they got promoted.
Yeah,
big promotion. That's a huge promotion. So he was born in 82 AC at Blackhaven, and we're not sure what year he was knighted, but probably very young, given he was in the Kingsguard by 23. So he was probably in that 16, 17, 18 knighthood range, which is way ahead of the curve. So we're talking basically one of the best fighters of his generation. He won the melee at Maidenpool at age 21, roughly, and that was celebrating Viserys' ascension. This is the time when he defeated Daemon Targaryen, knocking Dark Sister from his hands. Again, I'm just like, how did he wield Valyrian steel in a tournament?
Yeah, why would you do that? Were they trying to kill each other? I mean, as we know, from the main series, they're using blended weapons throughout in order to prevent them from losing life and limb. And even that's not a sure thing, as we know that one of the plots that was at work in the Game of Thrones was that they were hoping to kill Robert Baratheon during the melee, or at least Varys says as much to Eddard Stark. So using Valyrian steel seems like an extremely dangerous way of doing a tourney fight, but I don't know. Why would they do that? Why? It
might be an example of the sources just being wrong. They're just assuming, well, that's his sword, so he would be wielding it. But maybe they just made a bad assumption. I don't know. But I like your idea better because I prefer to think of it as something that really happened with and then try to worry about why, because it's interesting. Now, so after this victory, Criston Cole gives the victor's laurel to 7-year-old Rhaenyra. And this is possibly, he's playing favorites. She's the heir. It makes sense to do that. Why not do that? And this is maybe when she catches, she starts noticing him more. A lot of probably young girls take note of Criston Cole at this point. He was handsome and a great warrior, beating everyone. So, that's a pretty big deal. Now here, let's talk about the era where he came to his own in. This is pretty important because the style and the social elements are really important here. Criston becoming joining the Kingsguard on the death of Rhaenyra Redwine is a really big deal. Rhaenyra Redwine was on the Kingsguard for 45 years by the time he died, and he was probably the longest Kingsguard in service at that point. That record was broken eventually by a guy called Long Tom Costain. But a nice name, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I love it.
But probably Rhaenyra Redwine had the longest stretch of Kingsguarding before that. And this guy was ultra famous. He was like, I don't know, Gerald Hightower is one of the best comps we can come up with, but even Gerald Hightower only led the Kingsguard for 25 years, which is a really long time, but almost 45 years is so much longer. So this is a guy that really set the standard for Kingsguard, and I think that's when you have a really powerful domineering figure that just is so perfect, it really sets the stage for other people to live up to that. What do you think about the idea that Criston Cole was stepping into some pretty big shoes here?
I think it's interesting because I think it illustrates something about the psychology, right? And that he is stepping into some very big shoes, as you were saying, but it's also he's stepping into some very a very noble cause. At the same time, he's also stepping into it at a young age. And I get a lot of Jaime Lannister vibes from that, where Jaime was knighted at a very early age and then assumes the Kingsguard at a very early age after Cersei convinced. There's some theories that go into it about about the convincing Aerys II to take Jaime into the Kingsguard. And Jaime makes this point about whether it was the White Cloak that changed him or he that changed the White Cloak. And I do kind of wonder what Criston Cole's life was like before this moment. Was he always aspiring to this role? We don't get the same sense that Jaime was always aspiring to becoming a Kingsguard knight until Cersei convinced him that this would be the chance for them to be in King's Landing together and never be separated. Without a point of view chapter from Criston Cole, which I can't imagine we'll ever get, we can't be sure what Criston Cole's life was like before he ended up assuming the Kingsguard role. But having that kind of archetypal amazing forebear in the form of Ryan Redwine in his place does lead him to probably having to do a lot of measuring up. Like, is he actually going to be the same sort of Kingsguard knight that Ryan was? Can he fulfill that role? Can he at least match the value that Ryan Redwine brought to the Kingsguard? It was probably unclear to him as an early 23-year-old dude, but I'm sure he had a lot of aspirations and maybe a little bit of arrogance because, what male who's 23 years old doesn't have a little bit of arrogance when they're seeing a big role like that, right?
Especially with that kind of skill backing you up, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a great take, Jeff. And also to add to this, some of the things we know about Ryan really help set the stage for this and indicate maybe the type of man that Criston was at least trying to be, which is that Ryan was one of these very, he's the one that caught Lucamore the Lusty and reported them to Sir Giles Morrigan, the celibacy vow. So he, unless he was some giant hypocrite, which is possible, but given such a long career, he never slipped up. At least he never got caught. Yeah. And that's pretty telling. So the guy, if y'all don't remember, Sir Lucamore is the one who had a whole bunch of 16 children with 3 different women while he was in the Kingsguard. Mm-hmm. And that obviously didn't go over well. So if you're trying to fill the shoes of Ryan Redwine, and he's a guy that upheld the celibacy part of being a Kingsguard, well, this is perhaps a part of the evidence pointing to Rhaenyra being the one to come on to Criston Cole rather than the other way around. Now, of course, he could have just been, into little girls. We don't know. We have no idea. But
God damn it, Aziz. Wow.
Right? It just happens, right? It's gross. But, this is George R. R. Martin we're talking about. He's not going to pull punches on something like that. So, but I don't personally believe that. I don't think that's likely. I think that because of the environment Criston Cole was brought up, the type of man he was trying to be, I feel like he was looking at her kind of like a daughter, and she had this kind of schoolgirl crush that maybe grew into something else. But I'm not here to tell people they're wrong if they feel the other way. Which way do you lean on? We may as well get into that. We're about to talk about Rhaenyra, so what do you think? On which side of that do you take, if you have one at all?
I tend to favor this idea that Mushroom brings out, because there's a great essay on the Tower of the Hand website from a number of years ago after the World of Ice and Fire came out, which is Mushroom is always right. And I don't accept that Mushroom is always right necessarily, but I think he's 95% correct. I think it was more likely that Rhaenyra used the training that Daemon Targaryen was giving her in order to test it out on someone who could be, the epitome of the Kingsguard knight, right? If she can seduce Criston Cole, who is the shining example of what the Kingsguard knight was at the time, then she could prove that she could seduce anyone, and then she has the wiles in order to do that sort of thing. But I find it ambiguous, and I find it more likely that it was Rhaenyra who came onto him than Criston Cole who came onto her. But I do accept the possibility that it was Criston Cole that was actually interested in her. I do think the age disparity early on, when he gave her the laurel after winning the tourney was something that more likely than not inspired Rhaenyra's fascination with Criston Cole. I would think maybe and hope that Criston wasn't necessarily interested in a 9-year-old girl at the time.
I sure hope not.
You like you were saying, George is not coy about playing with these things. He has introduced a lot of those elements in A Song of Ice and Fire. So I think it's important that we leave it as open as a possibility for sure.
Yeah, we just hope it's not true.
Right, yeah.
Although if it is, then yeah, a good thing that he got killed the way he did. Sanrixian Super Chat. Love y'all. Thanks for keeping us entertained. Great choice of subject. Well, much love to you, Sanrixian. Please check out Sanri's artwork. She is so very talented and prolific.
She's great. Love her.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the Cole and Rhaenyra's time together and how this all worked out and led to it. I'll read the first half of this quote. Jeff, you take the second half.
All right.
With his pale eyes, coal-black hair, and easy charm, Cole soon became a favorite of all the ladies at court, not the least amongst them Rhaenyra Targaryen herself. So smitten was she by the charms of the man she called my White Knight, that Rhaenyra begged her father to name Sir Criston her own personal shield and protector. His grace indulged her in this, as in so much else. Thereafter, Sir Criston always wore her favor in the lists and became a fixture at her side during feasts and frolics.
Yet Princess Rhaenyra continued to sit at the foot of the Iron Throne while her father held court, and his grace began bringing her to meetings of the small council as well. Though many lords and knights sought her favor, the princess had eyes only for Sir Criston Cole, the young champion of the King's Guard and our constant companion. Sir Criston protects the princess from her enemies, but who protects the princess from Criston Cole? Queen Alicent asked one day at court.
Now that's, Nina tells us this is a borrowing of Juvenal's satires, the Roman writer, and this is interesting because he's making fun of the concept of the idea that if a woman is really this wanton, what good is locking her up going to do? She'll just, if she's that determined to sleep with somebody, then she'll sleep with her guards. So of course it's just because the whole thing is kind of ridiculous. You can't do that. And well, some societies have just gone even farther with that. That's where the whole idea of eunuchs come from. And, in some cases you have women protecting women, but that's less common. Still, it's probably better to go the other way with this. But, this is what we're dealing with. And Mushroom says, let's run through this real quick. Mushroom says Rhaenyra wanted a relationship with Criston Cole, which is interesting because Mushroom is pro Rhaenyra. So the fact that he says she wanted a relationship with Criston Cole is a pretty strong argument because you would think he would be taking her side on things, or like you said, maybe he's just telling the truth. He's not trying to spin it, maybe exaggerating it, but he's not totally changing what happened. Do you think that's a pretty important point there? The fact that Mushroom is the one saying Rhaenyra wanted a relationship with Cole?
Absolutely. I think the fact that he is biased on Rhaenyra's behalf, and then he brings up a kind of not so flattering account about Rhaenyra, I think it speaks to the veracity of what Mushroom is saying. And now, of course, there are other accounts that are beyond Mushrooms that indicate something else. And they do, interestingly, Eustace is the one who's pro-green, right?
Yeah.
So he's the one that comes up with an opposite. We'll talk about him in a moment, but he's the one that comes up with the opposite perspective on Criston Cole and Rhaenyra, which is interesting. So are we supposed to have that? So in my mind, I'm thinking that both Mushroom and Eustace have equal reasons to be telling the truth here, but one of them has to be wrong, right? I mean, they can't both be right at the same time, unless there's a little bit of both happening at the same time, and they're recording only one set of circumstances and experiences from one side, the green side, and Mushroom doing it from the black side. Again, it's really a touchy, interesting issue. It is.
The fact that each source kind of confirms the story that you would expect the other side to confirm based on favoritism is very confounding. It's like, wait, Mushroom should be the one saying that Criston did it, and Septon Eustace should be saying Rhaenyra is the one. Nope, that's opposite. So, so some of the other details that Mushroom lays out is that Daemon, you referred to this earlier briefly, Daemon offered to train Rhaenyra in seduction and how to seduce men. Viserys found out. King Viserys found out, obviously he was not happy about this, is that his brother was teaching his daughter how to seduce men. Most parents don't want to find that out or have that happen. And in response, Daemon's like, well, then I'll marry Rhaenyra. And Viserys is like, what? How is that a solution? And so Rhaenyra, again, according to Mushroom, goes to Criston and offers to sleep with him after, partly in response to being told she's going to have to marry Laenor. Now, Laenor was not interested in women, so you can see why Rhaenyra would be not so into that idea, marrying a guy who's not going to be into her at all, especially because at this point she's really used to having lots of attention. She's the realm's delight, and she's apparently incredibly beautiful, and just, a lot of people want her favor. People fight duels for her all the time. So that's from someone in that perspective with that much power over men to be, have your star hitched to a guy who's not interested in you at all because he's into men as well, that would be, you would want to avoid that, I think, if you're her. So this is what we're told. Mushroom says Criston was horrified and spurned her. He just was like, oh my God, you're not the person I thought you were. I thought you were this wonderful princess who I can think is very honorable and noble and chaste, and you're nothing like that at all. And so, he turned on her, and this is when Rhaenyra went to sleep with Harwin Strong. She found, encountered him in the hallways, and he was kind of the shoulder to cry on, sort of the other man.
Strong shoulder. He's a strong shoulder to cry on.
Strong shoulder to cry on. Ba-doom. Nice one. Yeah. Okay, so why don't you tell us Septon Houston's account, since I just ran through mushrooms. Let's get the other side of this.
Yeah, so Septon Eustace, we were saying before, he's backing the Green, so his account is coming from Aegon II's court. And his perspective was that Rhaenyra slept with Daemon and then asked to marry him, which Viserys refused. So we have a little bit of commonality, at least one strand of commonality, in that Daemon in Mushroom's account asks if he can marry Rhaenyra to Viserys, and Viserys rejects him. Here in Eustace's account, Rhaenyra sleeps with Daemon and then asks to marry him, which of course Viserys refuses. And then Criston Cole then goes to Rhaenyra after she was betrothed to Laenor to confess his love for her, offering to go into exile in Essos with her, which is interesting. That's an interesting perspective. And then finally, Rhaenyra refused him because she was meant for more than to live out her life as the wife of a common sellsword, and did not trust that he would keep his marriage vows if he did not care about his Kingsguard vows, which is an interesting point because, as we know, if you're willing to break one vow, there's a likelihood that you can break more than one vow. Yes. And this is something that's brought up specifically in Jon Snow's storyline in A Dance with Dragons and A Storm of Swords. If you are actually breaking your vows as a Night's Watchman, are you actually worthy keeping on as a Night's Watchman, which is then decided by, isn't actually decided until Jon goes out to Mance Rayder's camp, and then Stannis arrives and saves the day, as he often does. But we have to have the token Stannis reference in this episode, which has nothing to do with our king in the north, king in the north. But yes. So it's interesting, I think, that we have these two different accounts. And I'm curious, do you see similarities or common themes between Mushroom and Eustace's account? Is that the way that we can determine some of the truth statements that are being issued by both of these historians about the time?
I think it helps a lot. If we hone in on what's the things that the two accounts agree on, or at least seem to agree on, that definitely seems to help, because that gives us a lot of confidence that at least those parts are probably accurate. If both sources agree, it's more solid than some of the other things they're said, especially the things that they conflict on. For example, they both seem to agree there was at least some kind of sexual relationship with Daemon, or sexually oriented relationship with Daemon prior to her marrying Laenor. There was talk of this marriage between Daemon and Rhaenyra prior to her marrying Laenor, even though Viserys was against it. The idea came back when Viserys was dead, clearly. And a private meeting between Criston and Rhaenyra before her marriage to discuss one's love for the other. That, one way or another, the sources agree that this thing happened where one confessed the love for the other. We don't know which was on the receiving end and which was on the giving end, but they seem to agree that this confrontation happened. And then they both agree that whatever happened, Criston hated Rhaenyra afterwards. However it went, Criston came out really hating Rhaenyra, whether because he was jilted or because he was disgusted. His behavior seems more like being jilted, but it's also, even though I'm kind of leaning towards Rhaenyra being the one who instigated, but there is evidence going, you can certainly look at it and see evidence for the other side of it.
I definitely agree with that. I think that there's the similarities I think are interesting, that we can get part of the truth. And that's something that George has talked about when he's writing Fire and Blood. And he's sourcing this back to real world history, where we have a number of historians from ancient times to medieval times, even modern times, that are all taking one perspective and are coming with a biased point of view. Now, a lot of times what historians do is that they take, if they have multiple sources, and a lot of times they don't, they only have one source to illustrate one particular period of time in history, they will try to compare different sources and try and find the truth statements therein. So I know, when I was in college, I took a class called Judaism at the Time of Jesus and Hillel, which talks about what the true statements are from the New Testament, how that could be compared against things like Josephus, Tacitus, other different Roman historians, because they're all coming at it with very unique and different understandings and unique and different perspectives. And finding the commonalities between all the different sources generally indicates a larger degree of truth than when they're coming from a single source. Because I know for a lot of Roman history, when we get into the 3rd and 4th centuries, because I know we're both fans of the History of Rome podcast.
Oh yeah.
As they were going through that kind of chaotic period in Roman history, there's only 1 or 2 sources for a lot of these Roman emperors that are lasting for 4, 5, 6 months. And so we don't actually know whether it's true or not. And so we have to like bring in other things like archaeology, like songs, like burial grounds and burial mounds. We don't really have that in the case of Westeros because, again, it's not real. As much as it is real in our hearts, it's not necessarily, we can't go and dig up, the battle of the god over the God's Eye and find the bones of the dragon or whatnot and compare it to the historical record. That
Believe me, I've tried.
I'm sure you have. Yeah, you're out there with your little toothbrush there.
Yeah, I'm looking.
Bones, yeah.
No bones yet. I haven't given up though.
It's good. It's keep strong. Keep strong. Harwood's strong.
Yeah, Harwood's strong. So let's move on to the next phase here, which is Cole's switching sides here. His immediate move was to turn to Queen Alicent. So here's a quote. This includes some of the things we discussed already, kind of shoring it all up. Denied Rhaenyra's favor, Criston Cole turned to Queen Alicent instead. Wearing her token, the young Lord Commander of the Kingsguard defeated all challengers, fighting in a black fury. He left Breakbones with a broken collarbone and a shattered elbow, prompting Mushroom to name him Broken Bones thereafter. But it was the Knight of Kisses who felt the fullest measure of his wrath. Cole's favorite weapon was the Morning Star, and the blows he rained down on Sir Laenor's champion cracked his helm and left him senseless in the mud. Bloodborne from the field, Sir Joffrey died without recovering consciousness 6 days later. So now he's fully on Alicent's side, and that leads to him discussing things with, or moving on to Aegon. So before we move on to that, though, looks like we have a couple of comments from folks here. We have a comment from Newtrock44, who's he's referring to some Crusader Kings traits here. He's like, Rhaenyra had the lustful trait and a high intrigue skill. Criston had the chaste trait and a martial focus. No wonder it didn't work out. Yeah, that sounds about right. Shannon0893 says, what if they both wanted to sleep with each other? Cole only if they went into exile to be public. Rhaenyra on the side of staying. Okay. I guess that's possible. Yeah, they couldn't agree on the terms of a relationship. I guess that's a worthy enough third possibility that they both were into each other, but the way they would have to do it didn't work. He would say they have to leave. His thing was for them to leave and go live in the free cities, and her idea was presented as, well, you can be my lover and I'll still be the queen, I guess, and he's not okay with that.
Yeah,
so
she wouldn't want to give up being the queen.
Yeah, that's a lot to give up. So that
maybe there's like the Jaime Cersei parallel, like in A Storm of Swords, where Cersei comes to Jaime and says, we can live as the Targaryens did. We can be brother and wife, and I can remain the queen and you can be my lover, or we can get married or whatnot. Jaime's like, no, we cannot do that sort of thing. We would be stoned. We would lead to an instant rebellion. Basically, we are proving what Stannis Baratheon has said is actually correct, which of course it is, but we would be showing the realm that, Stannis was the one who was right all along.
Yeah, and of course this isn't quite the same as brother-sister, but it's close enough in terms of being very, very not okay for a queen to marry a Kingsguard. That's supposed to be completely off limits. That's not as bad as incest, but it's definitely a no-no. It's
frowned upon broadly.
Yeah, it's hard to measure up to as bad as incest. That's a tough bar to clear. So yeah, all right. So Jeff, why don't you read this next quote? We're talking about Criston Cole's presents arguments as to why they can't allow Rhaenyra to inherit the throne, and some of them are decent arguments. Some of them are self-serving. We'll get into that.
Yeah, there's a lot of both going on at the same time, which is what often is happening in the Dance of the Dragon. So I read part of this quote before, but I'll read it again in full because the full quote is just glorious the way that George actually sets this up.
Yeah.
So Sir Criston Cole spoke up. Should the princess reign, he reminded them, Jacaerys Valerian should rule after her. Seven save the realm if we seat a bastard on the Iron Throne. He spoke of Rhaenyra's wanton ways, the infamy of her husband. They will turn the Red Keep into a brothel. No man's daughter will be safe, nor any man's wife. Even the boys. We know what Laenor was. So, wow, that's a quote right there for our boy Criston Cole. I mean, like you were saying, there are some legitimate grievances and interesting ideas that are presented, like having Daemon as the Queen's consort may not be the best idea for a peaceful Westeros. Remember, this is the guy that attempted to conquer the Stepstones and involve Westeros in that war for a really, really long time. Has a history of taking out his personal grievances and corrupting the recently formed Gold Cloaks and King's Landing. So those all seem like legitimate arguments. But what about the other stuff about turning the Red Keep into a brothel, that kind of homophobia he's exhibiting to, that no man's daughter will be safe nor any man's wife? Were they any daughters safe before, Daemon was around? Any man's wife, safe before that as well? I mean, it feels like there's a bit of hypocrisy on what Criston Cole is saying, even if he does have a point about Daemon specifically. I think it's the only really solid point that he has in his argument against seating Rhaenyra on the Iron Throne. I
think that's true. I agree with that. I think Cole is doing that thing where people assume gay men are also into boys, which is, there's no evidence of that for Rhaenyra that I know of. I mean, it's possible, but it's probably just slander. And it comes from his perspective. If he's this overly chaste man, then he's going to have he's going to look down on any kind of sexual freedom that people have. But that would be, if this was a real incrimination, then it would be serious, but it probably isn't. And the other idea that, like you said, people are going to be sleeping around with each other. I mean, that's going to happen anyway.
Right.
But the idea that the queen's children are bastards, the idea that Jaehaerys Velaryon is a bastard, that to you and me, probably to almost all of us, that we don't care. But Westeros does care about that. I mean, Ned Stark cared about that. Ned Stark didn't want Joffrey to inherit because he wasn't Robert's son. And Jaehaerys Velaryon is Rhaenyra's son, though. It's the father that's in dispute. So this is not quite the same thing, but I think it's worthy of discussion. Where do you fall on that particular nuance of the issue, on the Jaehaerys' birth issue?
I tend to favor that he's Harbin Strong's son. I mean, it's clear that Rhaenyra was not especially faithful to her betrothed. But does it actually matter though in the long term? I think the Song of Ice and Fire broadly is exploring that, whether being a bastard is actually evil as a common practice in the North. Snow is an evil name. So when is what Ygritte tells Jon Snow in A Clash of Kings, rather, and that kind of goes throughout, whether talking about people like Ramsay. But I think ultimately it's not necessarily whether you have a bastard surname or whether you have no surname at all, but rather the deeds that you're doing that makes you noble or not. I think that's a point that's being brought up a lot in a character like Davos, right? Who's extraordinarily lowborn, does not have is raised up to knighthood and then lordship by Stannis, and is exhibiting noble characteristics. And that's what ultimately makes someone worthy of leadership, as opposed to the surname that you have, whether you are actually the son of Laenor or you're the son of Harwin Strong. Those are important things in my mind. And just Jace, by all accounts, seems to be a pretty good dude all around. And I think that's important. And that's what makes him, valuable to be the potential inheritor of the Iron Throne. Not that he may not actually be Laenor's son.
Right on. Well said. Now, another issue that comes up that's very important, Cole doesn't mention it here, but after this point, once this debate goes on a little further and it's pretty clear that the Green faction is going to make their move, well, Aegon himself has to be included. That's at the point they're at right now. The guy who most needs to be bought in, the prince himself, Aegon II, the one who's going to take his sister's crown, he has to agree to it. And to this point, he hasn't even been involved in the discussions. So that has to happen. And it's Criston Cole that goes to him and says, hey, if your sister, you should rise up against your sister. And he's like, well, what kind of man does that? What kind of man steals his sister's crown? So at first, okay, good attitude. That is the right attitude. But Cole says, but wait, what's going to happen once they ascend? Do you really think that Rhaenyra and Daemon are just going to let you be? Daemon's going to have you executed. Now, I can't say he's wrong. I think there's a very good chance Daemon would have had them executed. And consider the treatment of Adam Velaryon. Like, Rhaenyra does not treat him well. He's as loyal as they come, but he gets deemed a risk because he's a bastard. But this is awfully hypocritical, right? Rhaenyra's own kids are bastards. And she seemed quite willing to execute people who were deemed a threat, even if it was often other people fueling her paranoia. I mean, just a lot of things that made her paranoid. But maybe she was kind of a paranoid person in the first place. It's kind of unclear. If this hadn't been a Civil War scenario, maybe she could have just, she ascends and there's no worry of her brother trying to usurp her, then maybe it goes fine. But on the other hand, Alicent Hightower was ambitious. Otto Hightower was ambitious. Sunfire would have just been getting larger and larger, right? The danger from the other dragons on the green side would have been getting bigger. Because that's a big thing at the beginning of the war, is the blacks have a significant dragon advantage. that advantage would have fallen off over time as the other younger dragons caught up. So where do you fall between these? Do you think that two-part question here? Do you think that Aegon, that Cole was right that Alicent's children would be executed? And do you think that war between these two factions would have been kind of a foregone conclusion no matter what?
I think it was inevitable. I mean, and I do think that they would have been executed. I think that Aegon II would have died. And would we have cared? I don't know. I mean, Aegon II isn't necessarily the best dude in the world. I also am interested too about we were talking about sources, and Aegon II seems very blasé about assuming the Iron Throne, and Criston Cole has to convince him of that. Is that post facto kind of like Aegon II wasn't actually interested in the Iron Throne because he lost? In fact, what was actually occurring was that he was just kind of dragged in by his evil, wicked counselors. That is something we'll talk about a little bit later on when it comes to the role of the evil counselors to the king or the queen, and how they actually operate as sort of a patsy for the wrong deeds that are being done on behalf of the regent, because the regent can never be actually blamed for any of the wrongdoing that happens in the realm.
Of course not.
No, you can't blame Aegon II. He didn't want it in the first place. All he wanted to do was to hang out with his paramour in his room all day long. Not so sure about that one, but we'll leave that aside for right now because we don't have any other sources which say otherwise. But I do think there is an issue of bias there, as was throughout Fire and Blood is going to be a major issue.
I totally agree.
I think too is that Alicent has a point, but then again, she's also ambitious. And this is one of those things about the Dance of the Dragons that is both good and also a little bit frustrating, in that there's no clear side. There's no House Stark that you could be like, these guys are obviously in the right. They were wronged by one side, and they have done the best they could to operate justly and operate ethically in a wartime setting, for the most part, with some kind of nuances and ambiguities, as we're getting into it at Clash of Kings of the Nauticast podcast.
Yeah.
But it's different though with the Greens and the Blacks, and that I don't see a lot of evidence that these guys are particularly that appealing. That really I do think there is a bit of villain coding when it comes to the Greens, but ultimately I think that they're both not great sides. It's really hard to be like, yeah, I'm a supporter of the Blacks, I'm the supporter of the Greens, and I could be like, I think that Rhaenyra was the rightful queen. I could say that Daemon Targaryen was likely a guy who would then execute everyone, and that kind of makes it hard to be like really, really strong on behalf of Rhaenyra, or really, really strong on behalf of the Greens and Aegon II. How do you come down? I've never actually asked you this before. Are you a green guy? Are you a black guy?
Well, I'm wearing the green shirt, but I agree with you that it's basically unexcitedly I go with the blacks because, like you said, that's the law. I mean, that's the best thing you can. I think when you're coming down to it, the king named her as a successor, and I prefer the succession to pass through to the oldest child, because I think the person that most caused the dance, legally speaking, the one who set the precedent, perhaps more than anyone else, as much as everybody loves him, and there are good reasons to love him, but it was Jaehaerys' fault. And and Alysanne, good Queen Alysanne, was insistent that this would cause problems later. She was right. Alysanne is so smart and wise. She was totally right. I really go off on this point in our Radio Westeros collab on the Dance of the Dragons, talking about how this was Jaehaerys just should have let the oldest person inherit. None of this would have happened if that was established. Just let the oldest one inherit, and it removes so much complication. So that's another reason I support the blacks, is it supports the simplistic solution of always letting the oldest one inherit.
Agreed. I agree.
Cool. So what does all this tell us about the inevitability of young Griff and Daenerys? Is there hope for peace between the two factions, or are they also just, there's no way that this can't come down to war? Let me give a one reason why it might not come to war, or it might not end in death. I think it will start as war, but there's one historical example that gives us hope that it might be resolved peaceably, and that is the example of Gaemon Palehair. Let's recall who Gaemon Palehair is. He was foisted upon the Iron Throne by Tristan Truefire, what's that guy's name? Sir Perkin the Flea, right? Yeah, Sir Perkin the Flea. Yep. And during the anarchy in King's Landing that occurred when there was no one on the Iron Throne, when after Rhaenyra had left and Aegon was long gone, there was just total chaos in King's Landing, people fighting and just blood in the streets. And Gaemon Palehair was foisted upon the realm as a son of, I forget, a bastard son of, was it, it doesn't matter, Viserys, I believe.
Yeah, Viserys, yeah.
And he had the hair color to make it look right, to fit the part. And it was determined that he wasn't really a bastard, but because he or a descendant of Viserys, and his counselors were killed off or sent to the wall, and that was all undone. However, they didn't execute him for one reason. There's no need to. He was proven to not be a bastard of Viserys. So there's no longer a threat. His claim was gone. And thus, and being a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, they're like, well, we don't really need to kill a non-bastard child of a king. He's just a regular kid. He ends up being Aegon III's food taster. They become friends. So, and of course, he is killed tasting food, but dang it.
So he does die. So he is ultimately killed by the Dance of the Dragons.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, anyway.
Okay.
Well, I guess that was a few years later. But anyway, still. So couldn't that happen with young Griff? Because Dany, the visions of Dany is that she's going to slay the lie of the cloth dragon on poles and the mummer's dragon, not necessarily slay the fake dragon himself. If young Griff is proven definitively to not be Rhaegar's son, his claim vanishes and there's no reason to kill him. Could that be what we're seeing here? Or do you think young Griff's just gonna go down in flames, perhaps literally?
Oh man, it's an interesting. Yeah, I think this is the first iteration of this argument that I've heard that actually makes sense to me, that could be resolved somewhat peacefully. And I think too, you have to talk about real world history, as we know from 15th from the Wars of the Roses, was Perkin Warbeck, right? It was the guy who was the alleged son of one of the Henrys or whatnot. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And then he invades England on behalf of, and he goes to Ireland, he goes to France, he's recruiting people, he brings them over and attempts to unseat Henry, one of the Henrys, again, I'm not sure which one off the top of my head. And then I think it's either him or another one of these pretender type figures who is then later sent to the kitchens and is not actually executed. He's the one that becomes the taster for the king, or for the king's son. I can't remember which one. So that George is sourcing that to real world history. Again, my details are a little bit vaguer than they really should be. I should have written this down in the notes, but I think it's but I do think it does do some work in there. So yeah, I could see that as a possibility, that Dany doesn't, make, baby Aegon, roasted Aegon over King's Landing, or some other way that she could dispose of him. I do think that this lie that she has to slay is interesting, but I also think too, so one of the aspects about young Griff is that he's not so much a character in the story, and this is going to sound weird, but he's not so much a character in the story as opposed to a series of ideals that people are foisting on him. Jon Connington is looking at him as the way that he could avenge Rhaegar Targaryen. Varys is looking at him as the perfect prepared prince that is so well prepared. Look at all these things. He has done so many wonderful, awesome things. He has fished with fishers. He has ridden on horses. He has gotten an education from a septa, as he announces to in Kevin Lannister's epilogue. So I think you would have to clear out a lot of Aegon's counselors before you would get to Aegon. And then we have another aspect too, which kind of comes into significant play as we're entering into early in the Winds of Winter, and that's the form of Arianne Martell, who remains extraordinarily ambitious and is extraordinarily interested in becoming the Queen of Westeros. Because, as we learn at the end of A Feast for Crows, and as we explore in The Dance of Dragons and her Winds of Winter sample chapters, she has now learned that originally she was going to be the one who was going to marry Viserys in the original pact that the Dornish had signed with Daenerys, with the Targaryen, the Sea Lord, the Sea Lord and Witness. So with that being in mind, you'd have to clear out a lot of these major players around young Griff before you actually get to the point where he could potentially be saved. And the other aspect too, I think, is worth bringing up, is the type of character that Dany is going to be when she arrives in Westeros. As she stands right now at the end of A Dance with Dragons in Meereen, maybe she would be the one to spare Aegon, but the character that she'll turn up in with the Winds of Winter likely going to be a little bit different, a little bit more prone to some of these violent, as I've talked about before, this kind of prophetic conception around herself, this destined figure, the Azor Ahai reborn, when she encounters the R'hllorites and the Winds of Winter, and how that's going to interact with the lie that she has to slay.
I agree, yeah.
So I think it's interesting. I would hope that's the case. I mean, I don't think there's anything necessarily particularly bad about young Griff besides the people around him. He seems like a pretty okay dude all around. We don't know much about him, but I do think that she has to clear out all of his counselors and all of their desires to rule Westeros before she would end up bringing him you end up saving him and bringing him into her services. So I'm curious, do you actually like believe that argument that young Grift is going to end up surviving in the Winds of Winter?
I think it's
End up
possible.
surviving Dany?
I do think it's possible because the example of Gaiman Palehair is so unusual, and the reason I got on this idea was because I used to be so I've looked so hard at the parallels with Aegon III himself and seeing him as an excellent proto Jon Snow and proto Bran Stark, and thinking about just who this character would be. This Gaiman Palehair character is so odd paired in there, and I thought at first maybe Gaiman was an example of maybe a different character who would have thought they were king or had some sort of claim, and that they set it aside, like Jon himself maybe. But ultimately, I think the slaying of the lie part is what really gets me, because that's such a big part of what happened with Gaiman, is that he was foisted, and then the people that foisted him admitted that he wasn't really that. And that could, I mean, John Connington can't admit that. He doesn't know. But Varys, maybe, and see, that's a big problem with this theory, is someone has to admit that Aegon's not legit. That has to come out somehow. Now, how does that happen? Well, I don't know. That is a big challenge for the realm to believe that he's not truly Rhaegar's son, when they're doing so much to try to make people think he's Rhaegar's son. It might be kind of hard to undo that, but it's possible.
Dany's going to Pentos, right? Probably in the Winds of Winter. And who is in Pentos? But Illyrio, and who is the potential father of young Grift?
The real dad. Yep, real dad. He might have to give up his secrets there. So that could be that might be it. But there's still the matter of getting people to believe that, and it would be very interesting if young Griff himself accepted it. That would be really quite striking. That would make him more of a character than you know what I mean? We'd actually be getting into him as a person, which, as you say, we've very, very little of that has happened. We have a vague idea of his personality, and that's about it. His backstory is far more interesting than his personality to this point. So obviously, if they do fight, if there is a struggle to the death, clearly Dany's going to win that, but who knows at what cost, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to what I think is a very interesting bit with Cole and his death, and something that I think is peculiar, kind of along the same lines of the points here with Cole and Barristan's endgame, trying to figure out. The whole example of Gaiman Palehair is so strange to me, and I wonder if there's a modern parallel. Same here. So let's get into this and see what we can find. But before I do that, just wanted to back up real quick. You brought up Perkin Warbeck, whose nickname was the Kingmaker in real life, and his name is Perkin. And we just mentioned Perkin the Flea was the guy who brought up Gaiman Palehair. So, George is definitely thinking of these things. Of course, we didn't mention it, but all those examples you're given were Wars of the Roses era. Mm-hmm. So, and we all know Wars of the Roses is a big influence on the Game of Thrones. So, just more from that same source. All right, so I have a bunch of quotes here. I don't want to read them all because these take a little while. But the point is, there's this very odd moment late in Criston's campaigning life, not long before his actual death, when he's leading his men after having an argument with Aemond, who they can't decide on a plan of action. So Aemond decides, I'm going to just go burn the Riverlands. And Criston Cole's like, all right, well, I'm going to go do something that sounds a lot more intelligent to me anyway, which is take our army and go unite it with the other armies on our side down in the south in the Reach. That sounds pretty smart to me. However, he does not succeed in this goal. Now, what they're doing here in the Blacks are doing to Criston's army is so bizarre. I will read this part of the quote. 4 days out of Harrenhal, the attacks began. Archers hid amongst the trees, picking off outriders and stragglers with their longbows. Men died. Men fell behind the rear guard and were never seen again. Men fled, abandoning their shields and spears to fade into the woods. Men went over to the enemy. In the village commons at Crossed Elms, another of the ghastly feasts was found. Familiar with such sights by now, Sir Criston's outriders grimaced and rode past, paying no heed to the rotting dead, until the corpses sprang up and fell on them. A dozen died before they realized it had all been a ploy. The work, as was learned later, of a Myrish sellsword in the service of Lord Vance, a former mummer called Black Trombo. So what's happening here is in Criston's line of march, they're setting up corpses that look like they're having dinner and just playing out scenes of regular life. It's bizarre. And to me, I just can't help but think of undead whites, things like that in the Riverlands much later from now, and seeing things like that. corpses springing up and attacking them like human armies being assaulted by dead things. I can't not think of that. Do you think I'm reaching, or do you think this is just... Yeah. What do you think about this?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, George is making significant allusions throughout the narrative in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect to the others and the others' ability to raise the whites up. He's doing this intentionally, so we are always, even if we're not consciously putting it together like you just did, but we are constantly being reminded that this motif exists in A Song of Ice and Fire of the dead rising. And in this case, it is more they're not actually dead. They're actually rising up because we're playing deads, and then, for lack of a better term, and then we're then taking that and then ambushing our friend Criston Cole. And I think George is doing a really good job of doing that. I'm drawing a blank, but I know we talked about recently in the Nauticast podcast where there's moments where like the dead are being raised up constantly in this kind of illusion, but they're not actually dead, and that does speak to what the others do and how that actually strips away the humanity of these people. And to take your example, and it just kind of stretch it out even farther. It's this idea that that war is making corpses of people, and that people that are rising and are surviving this war are kind of dead on the inside. A lot of these folks that are coming out of the Dance of the Dragons, a character like Aegon III specifically, are really fucked up by the war, and they barely have any zest for life. And I think that is another point that George is integrating, and that the others are doing the same sort of thing outwardly and magically, but the same sort of effect exists within the, quote, real world, the realistic politics, regular world that's happening in both the Dance of the Dragons as well as the modern story in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Right on. Very well said. And of course, this is tied up with another piece of sort of endgame feel. The way Sir Criston's death happens here, well, maybe the moment before it, this line by Roderick Dustin, Sir Criston answered, "If there is to be battle here, many of your own will die as well." The Northman Roderick Dustin laughed at these words, saying, "That's why we come. Winter's here. Time for us to go. No better way to die than sword in hand." Now, we know who that sounds like. That's Big Bucket or whatever his name was. Let me taste blood off a Bolton skull or whatever it is he says. It's pretty similar. Similar sentiment. Last winter, they know they're not going to live much longer. May as well die with a sword in hand. So this is when we get that badass line we read at the beginning when Criston says, "Okay, then it's a fight to the death," but they don't give him that. They shoot him with arrows and let him drop dead right there. Now the ignominious death of Cole is another thing that leads us back to Barristan. Let's say Barristan is in the Riverlands leading an army of Aegon the VI, the Young Griffs, and he's fighting the dead, and something like this happens, or something remotely like this happens, and he just dies in a meaningless skirmish. Well, what would that remind you of, Barristan's death in a meaningless skirmish? That's pretty much what happens on the TV show, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So, I mean, like, a lot of folks think, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but a lot of folks think that Barristan will die at the Battle of Fire. And Barristan in that moment he is in his prime, right? He is sword in hand driving towards the Yunkish legions. As you guys talked about in that episode, the Battle of Fire episode from 8 or 9 years ago now. And all of that stuff is just this glorious like thrill of battle sort of thing. Barristan gives this amazing war speech in Barristan's first The Winds of Winter sample chapter, and then he's leading his men into battle. And that, to me, the example that brings out Criston Cole, to me, thinks that Barristan isn't going to die, in this kind of glorious manner at the Battle of Fire. That it's likely going to be a much more ignominious death than what we saw, similar to what we saw in Criston Cole. Not necessarily going out like a badass, fighting either the Yunkish or the Ironborn or Victarion or someone like that, but instead kind of going out like a chump. I think that's the way that Criston Cole goes out. I think it'd very much be the same way that Barristan goes out, hopefully later in the Winds of Winter or early in the Dream of Spring.
Right on. Okay, well, the last little bit of Criston Cole here before we take a little mid-roll break and move on to more focus on Barristan directly. What we said at the beginning is there a chance Cole is a victim of the history book? So let's add all that up together and see if we can maybe squint and see a case where he's very misunderstood. All right, so a couple things we agreed with him on, but Daemon being a terrible idea as king consort and the possibility of him executing his kin on the other side, on the green side. Jacaerys being bastard born, that's, we don't mind that as much, but it's legally speaking, he's got a point, I suppose you could say. Let's say he didn't kill Lyman Beesbury, just put him in jail. Let's say the Andal custom was something that's very important to him. I would disagree with him on that, but it may have legitimately, earnestly mattered to him. What about going on the offensive after he was made hand? He immediately takes to the field. I think that's pretty much what Barristan does. He has no patience for politics. He goes right to the fighting. That's what Barristan does at Marine, right? Barristan's walking around Marine like, I don't want to deal with this Skaznak or this Reznak, or I don't want to do
Skaznak.
Snack. Yeah.
Skaznak.
I don't want to deal with any of this. I want to just I understand sword in hand, enemy on the field. That's what he wants to get back to, and that sounds kind of like what Criston Cole was doing. So I don't know. Have we made a case with that, or does it fall short? And what else do you have to add to that? I guess let's turn that over to you.
I think we made the case really well that Criston Cole is the archetypal forebear for Barristan Selmy. I think it's really strong writing on George's part that he would include this story about this not random Kingsguard knight, but not random Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, but a whole lot of detail and information about this guy in Fire and Blood. And that let's talk a little bit about the meta side and about the inspiration for why George wrote Fire and Blood and what that possibly means for Barristan and Daenerys' story in the Winds of Winter. And just a caveat, it's just a theory. George has not come out and said I wrote this because I wanted to foreshadow events from the Winds of Winter. But I think it's very likely, as we're looking in Fire and Blood, that George's inspiration, in my mind, is because he wanted to do a lot of the groundwork that would make Barristan's turn, the second Dance of the Dragons, much more prominent and important, and have a lot of historical substantiation, which I think he had enough in the 5 published books, but it's George, so he has to go into enormous detail, which is great. It's great. It makes it so much more fun. So I was thinking about this and thinking about how the Dance of the Dragons occupies a major chunk of the imaginary history that George was writing after the publication of A Dance of Dragons. And the reason in my mind that George wrote this story was to provide some firm historical foundation for that aforementioned second Dance of the Dragons, something that George once said in a So Spake Martin from 2003 would be a subject of an entire book, aka The Winds of Winter. And so my argument is that the story of Criston Cole, which is really only hinted at by just a few point of view characters, Barristan being one of them, kind of grew out of this larger meta purpose. Why include such deep and lovely detail on just one Kingsguard knight and his various relationships with the nobles at court, his relationship to Rhaenyra? Certainly, it could be because George's love for a lived-in, vibrant universe is a big part of it. I mean, George loves to have his details and loves to embed a significant a significant amount of information that kind of makes these stories feel lived in and makes them feel real. But to me, it kind of makes more sense that George was interested in creating an archetypal figure for Barristan Selmy. And then George could then ground a character like, I don't know, say Lord Commander Barristan Selmy into that archetypal framework that Criston Cole currently occupies in the history. To me, that makes a lot of sense. I think when we're talking about Fire and Blood, we're talking about George's love for history. He's not just writing this in a vacuum, right? Ultimately, he's writing this because he wants to make his world much more strong and make the future books of the main series, The Winds of Winter and The Dream of Spring, feel that much more powerful and grounded in the history of Westeros. And, as we were talking about a little bit, because we just finished the Storm's End chapter we didn't finish it. We're halfway through chapter 3 from A Clash of Kings. But George does a ton of work in building up Storm's End as a castle and the history and mythos that go behind it.
Yeah.
But it's not just simply just like world building. It's also really flavoring the characters in the story. And when George is writing history, it's similar. It's not just world building. He's flavoring the current characters and the current narrative. Daenerys, Rhaenyra, Barristan, Criston Cole, Aegon II, young Griff, all of these characters are informing each other, and they're all kind of talking like this, kind of meeting at cross purposes, uniting and synthesizing to form this kind of grand, lovely narrative that George loves to build in his Song of Ice and Fire. So I think it's great. I mean, we've had some debates and conversations in the past in various mediums about whether Fire and Blood was worth it or not, but I've kind of come around to your perspective that Fire and Blood was actually worth it, and that allowing that foundation of world building and history makes for a much deeper.
So that's just speaks to George cleverness. Is he's creating a world that you can scale to your own interest level. If you want to be extremely interested and obsessed like we are, it's there for you. And if you want to just kind of keep it on the surface level, well, it's still going to be really good. So why don't you read this? You pulled a really good quote here that's a good lead into our transition to Barristan himself. Then we'll do our mid-roll, and then we've got a bit of questions that have built up, so we'll take care of those before going over Barristan's life.
Sounds good. So we get this from A Dance with Dragons, in which Reznak Mo Reznak, that famous character, sort of, says, "You were the Queen's man," said Reznak Mo Reznak. "The king desires his own men about him when he holds court. I am the Queen's man still, today, tomorrow, always, until my breath or hers." And that comes from A Dance with Dragons, the Queen's Man. Imagine that. And that's basically Criston Cole's quote could be as well. Yep. And I love to think about this quote in terms of because you guys are big fans and I'm as well. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Of you have that moment at the beginning of every episode, which starts with, "I am doing this following thing," and then the title card is, "The following thing did not happen," or whatnot. So, "I am the Queen's man still, today, tomorrow, always, until my last breath or hers," followed by the black, and then the screen text, "Barristan Selmy turns Cloak" on today's.
That is how it would work exactly. You nailed it. Okay, let's give a few shout outs to our supporters. Thank you very much to our Blood Rider patrons, who include Vorsaki, wielder of a Valyrian steel Arak with a Dragonbone hilt; Kohel Koi, called Sunpiercer, wielder of a Dragonbone bow; Kokavo the Tamer, wielder of the Wildfire Whip Gehenna. Oh my goodness, I accidentally skipped our patron shoutouts at the beginning, didn't I? Well, I better do those now. Talanis the Talon, king of Gagasos, rider of Talarius, a red dragon with scales, horns, and talons of midnight black; Hunter of House Blackcloud, the Stormrunner, king of the sky, rider of Heranicon, the Windworm, a dragon with scales of brilliant platinum silver, horns, claws, and fangs of pure white, with eyes the color of diamonds afire. We have new art for Hunter of House Blackcloud, but I don't know if we have it scanned in yet. But it looks really cool, so I guess we'll show that next time. I thought we'd have it ready this time. That's my fault. And we have some Queens of Love and Beauty to give a shout out to. From the depths of Fleabottom, Lord Ken of House Hammer has declared for Queen Carrie, Fire of the North, who recovered Dark Sister from beyond the wall. A laurel of glory in the name of love to Bud of House Beresford, Knight of Tolkien and Arbiter of Scotch from Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys, and Lady of Jameson. Also, of course, since I missed him at the beginning, we have Jeff Gnarly, the Long Snapper, History of Westeros' first sword. And I must shout out, because they're excellent people, our sellsword captains. It's their time for a shout out. And I've been looking for them this whole time. Here they are. Peter Blaze of the Emerald Isle, captain of the Werewood Wanderers. To long lives, quick deaths, cold beer, and warm women. Daegron, marshal of the Axe, captain of the Red Tide. Resistance is futile. Chiron Callsbane, captain of the Stone Shield. The torrent breaks upon the stone. Haima Helminth, captain of the Whispering Children. Dead men tell no secrets. Shepard, the shepherd of Essos. All men are sheep before the shepherd. Heir to the Whispering Children. Lady Lajara Dajo is the Iron Lily, Master Archer, Castellan of Summer Island Keep, Arboreal Point, Captain of the all-female Wailing Widows, that is, Women and Children First. Cody the Crimson is Bastard of Bracken, Captain of the Red Waste Exiles and Recruiter of the Free Folk. Cameron the Hammer of Hornwood is Captain of the English Lions with the motto, Honor is the reward of virtue. Lord Brandon Brewer of Castle Blackroon is Captain of the Shadow Wolves, Our steel is cold, our vengeance colder. Black Alex Sand is the Bastard of Spears, leader of the Bermuda Vanguard. And Bittersteel is Captain General of the Golden Company. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel, and our word is as good as gold. Now, for some questions from you guys. Looks like some comments, some questions. Alberto Gomez, 666, just tuning in but excited about this topic. Thanks for keeping me company while I deep clean my escape room. I bet there's a bit of that going on right now, huh? Amy Lantrip says, this is for the strong women, Rhaenyra and Ashea. Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate that, and so do they. Westeros Vampirus 90... Oh.
There's another strong woman.
Yeah, there's a strong woman.
Strong woman, yeah.
What? What, do I have the headphones on me? Because I'm recording an episode. You want to say hi to everyone?
Hi.
Say hi to everyone? No, it's okay. I love you. It's my friends, Aziz and Ashea, and about 7,000 other people.
Daddy.
Oh, hello. Sure, you want to say hi?
Yeah.
Who are they?
They're just, you want to say hi, or you want to go to night?
Hello.
Hi.
Hey.
They're right there. You want to see them on the screen? There's Aziz, my friend Aziz. All right, girls. I love you. Night, night, Julia. Night, night, Libby.
Mommy, here's his neighbor.
This is
Night, night, girls.
this is the best interruption we've ever had.
Sorry, yeah.
It's kind of funny what the line I was about to read before that was from Vampirist 99, Westeros being the sexist patriarchal place that it is. I think Cole and the Lords of Westeros would have an even bigger problem with the potential queen having a bastard than a potential king. That's a good point. I mean, it's not fair, but I think that's a good point that they would look down on the bastard of a queen even more than the bastard of a king as far as an heir. Yeah, that does fit. Too bad, but yes, I think you're right. Also from Vampirist 99, the only problem is that Warbeck, meaning Perkin Warbeck, was just a random dude, whereas Fagon is most likely a Blackfire, which makes him still a threat. That's a good point. That is a good point. Although whether his Blackfireness will be exposed is another matter. If that never comes out, if no one ever proves that, then that may not matter. But if it does, then it might. Nina says I made a mistake. The Kingmaker was Richard Neville, not Perkin Warbeck. That is, she's right about that. I screwed that up. But Perkin Warbeck was sort of Kingmaker-ish, but that wasn't his nickname. So good catch there. Thank you for that. I like to be accurate. Leon Rubenfeld says the story of Aegon III and Gaiman Palehair has many parallels to Tommen, both with the whipping boy scene and the food taster. The Silent Giant could be Robert Strong. And there's many more. Yeah, that's very true. This is worthy of further exploration, but I suppose it's not a little bit off topic. But thanks for the note because that is
it's a little
great
bit
take.
off topic. I think we have talked about it somewhere in our Aegon III, Jon Snow episode. I think we made other connections, other parallels.
I think you're right.
I'm definitely familiar with that because of stuff with the whipping boy and food taster.
Okay, yeah. Silent Giant would be Sandok, maybe.
Yeah, Sandok the Shadow.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, there's some strong parallels there for sure, and especially with Tommen being going out the window, which is what happens to what is it? Aegon's first wife, Aegon III's first wife, and one of Aegon's kids, right? Aegon II's kids. Yeah, lots of kids going out windows in the Dance of the Dragons. Joe Magician says dead with Victarion's axe in his skull. Whoa, that's a prediction for Barristan's death. Is he trolling, or is that what he really thinks will happen? I mean, it's possible.
Is Victarion even going to make it off of his ship before he blows Dragonbinder and explodes internally or something like that, or gets eaten by a dragon? I don't know.
Good question. I don't know. Violet Messiah 666 says if Victarion kills Barristan, I will burn my copy of The Winds of Winter. And a super chat from the New Dad podcast. Make sure to check out the New Dad podcast. That's a really good show, right? Just getting started talking about the experience of being a new dad. Hey, that's right up your alley, isn't it? I mean, you're not a new dad, but you haven't been a dad a long, long time. You know, like how long? You've been a dad for what, 4 years? Is that right?
3 years.
3 years.
My oldest is 3. My youngest is 2. So
you really got to appear on that podcast.
You might be a perfect guest for Tommy over there.
I will have to talk with it.
You've got some girls and he's got some boys.
Oh, well, we're not going to be arranging any marriages. I'll tell you that much right now.
I'm just saying.
But his kids have such good names.
Betrothals.
Shepherd and Sirius, right? Or Solomon, not Sirius.
Solomon, yeah.
I don't know why I said Sirius. Oh, because we made it was never mind. We talked about him during the CK2 stream, and that's where that comes from. But that's not worth explaining. So thanks again, Tommy, for the shout out. And again, check out the New Dad podcast, folks. All right, let's go to the life of Barristan and talk about things from his perspective, comparing him to Cole and just in general to himself. So we've gone through Cole's life, and Barristan was born 236 or 237, first son of Lionel, Knight of Harvest Hall. His sigil, 3 yellow stalks on wheat on brown. Cole's sigil was 10 black pellets, which is a strange sigil, really. Pellets? Why is pellets on a? Why is that a thing? Anyway,
the night of the kitty litter or something like that. Dog food.
And the current lord of Harvest Hall is Arstan, who is Barristan's great-grandnephew or great-nephew. Yeah, smart one there, Barristan. Calling yourself Arstan. He's just not very creative, is he?
That was enough for George to fool me back when I first read A Clash of Kings. Like, who is Arstan? Yeah. Like, oh my God, it's actually Barristan. Oh, wow. I was that asshole who got that wrong. Yeah.
So he squired for Manfred Swan. And I think Barristan's kind of like the Westerosi version of a child star. You know, you're noticed by everyone and revered from a very early age, and it kind of changes your life arc dramatically. It kind of determines who you are. You have less ability to be your own person because you're constantly being what other people expect you to be, and that is something that Criston Cole maybe had in common with him is that they were both incredible warriors early on, and that kind of set their fate. They both ended up Kingsguard by being the top warrior in the realm or near it. That put them on this very straight path. And real world child stars have all sorts of, I mean, of course there's exceptions, but it's common enough that they become depressed. They do the opposite of what these knights do, where they get deep into drinking and drugs and lots of sex with random people, which is the opposite of these guys. They're the opposite extreme of that. Whereas there's, as we talked about earlier, these guys, maybe neither of them have had sex ever, and they're certainly not going around getting wasted, and so it's kind of the opposite. They're not allowed to have these pleasures. It's more of that kind of side of it.
I like them too. It's like kind of like sports stars as well. Like, I mean, it seems like there's not really like a sense of sports in Westeros, but a lot of these guys feel like there's kind of prodigy athletes who rise up through middle school and high school, and then when they're on into like major league sports, whether that's baseball or football or whatnot, that they have a extreme amount of talent that they've developed over a long period of time. Because I mean, as we know from knights, they develop very, very early on, from a page to a squire to a knight is the typical role that people go through. Of course, some people never advance beyond the squire status, and I'm assuming some people don't also advance beyond the page status. But at the same time, like there's this kind of like almost like farm like system in terms of like developing knights. And so we have a character like Barristan Selmy who goes very early on from a page to a squire and then on to a knight, which makes him an extremely talented professional warrior or athlete, one of the two.
Yeah, right on. And I think athlete is probably a better example than child star, like a prodigy athlete, because tournaments are probably the closest thing we have to sports in Westeros. Nightly tournaments, that's probably a better parallel. So what was Westeros like around this time? Because we talked about that for Cole in terms of the knightly attitudes, like what was how was chivalry viewed, and who were the role models of that era. We talked about Rhaenyra and Redwine probably almost certainly being the biggest role model of his era. Well, somewhat similar, maybe different figures, but certainly some big names in this era. Barristan would have been coming up around the time that Sir Duncan the Tall would have perhaps been the most famous knight. Very good chance he was the most famous knight. He was the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and he had slain several Blackfires himself. So that helps. And going to, or not slain, but defeated. He was a big part of 3 different major Blackfire rebellions, winning them, and did kill one of the daemons directly. And so also Gerald Hightower would have been around. He was the new young Lord Commander after Summerhall, or maybe was already in the Kingsguard before Summerhall and just survived it. Not clear, but either way, young guy named very long career that was very well regarded. So, another role model might have been Prince Daeron, not specifically the son of Aegon V, the one who was also not into women, and he was a quote born soldier who rejoiced in tournament and battle and died in battle in about 8 years before Summerhall. So Barristan would have been a teenager during the Rat Hawk and the Pig Rebellion that claimed the life of this Prince Daeron. He may have either been just old enough to fight in it, or just quite not old enough to fight in it. And what we have, too, is maybe the possibility that he witnessed the marriage of Princess Rhaegal and Ormond, who married in 245. And this is kind of like seeing Rhaenyra get married early on, things like that. A little bit of parallels, small things. These aren't big parallels, but there are at least some similarities in their upbringing. And of course, he has the Bold incident when he gets his nickname at age 10, around the year 246, 247. And he was beaten by Duncan the Small in that tournament, and Duncan the Small is the one who gave him his nickname. So I just rattled off a whole lot of stuff. Do you have anything to say about any of that?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, about when Barristan is entering into, I mean, we haven't quite gotten there, but entering into the Kingsguard and the type of knights that were around when he came in. We were talking about Rhaenyra and Redwine before, and about Criston Cole stepping into his shoes after this long tenure as being the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and even longer tenure being a Kingsguard knight in total. These are big shoes for Barristan to be falling in on. And it's also interesting, too, in that characters as wide-ranging as Jaime to Ned Stark to others talk about the Kingsguard during this time, and about these specific Kingsguard knights, Gerald Hightower and Barristan being the two best examples, as being the Kingsguard Kingsguard knighthood at its best. And I do wonder whether that is a little bit of a distinction between Criston and Barristan. And this is a question for you guys because I actually don't know the answer for it. What was the Kingsguard like as Criston Cole was ascending it? Ryan Redwine is dead at that point. Who were the other 6 knights when Criston Cole ascends it? Were they actually good dudes in the same way that when Barristan steps in, Gerald Hightower seemingly, we'll talk about a little bit more, a little bit about the ambiguities about him, was a good guy. Was the Kingsguard knights that were ascending, that were in place when Criston Cole came into the Kingsguard actually legit? Were they good people?
It's hard to say because a lot of them turned out pretty good, but we're not sure if those were the ones who were actually there at the time. We know about the actions of the Kingsguard a lot better around the era when the war actually breaks out, but of course a lot of this happened 10, 15 years before the war, and so it's not that clear who was in the Kingsguard along with him. But the fact that Cole just rose above all of them is somewhat telling, right? There wasn't any kind of comparably amazing standout, at least we could say that much. And we do end up with guys who did some kind of crappy things. Some of the Kingsguard that stayed with Aegon II turned out to be really bad dudes. So it's hard to say, but it's worth considering for sure. Maybe we'll get more detail on that later.
Yeah, I mean, we've got 3 that stayed with Aegon II, in addition to Criston. So I think you could say that those 3 are not terribly reliable if they would betray their ruler. So I could say that, perhaps.
I think it was the Darkland who stole the crown to give to Rhaenyra, and then the Fell, and then one of the 2 twins that stayed with Rhaenyra.
But there was also Rickard Thorne.
Oh, Thorne, not Fell. I was thinking of Fell. I think Thorne is the one I was thinking of when I said Fell.
Aegon II had both Fell and Thorne.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, who's the third one with Rhaenyra then?
That was who was that? Oh, I guess it was Darkland. He was one of her Lord Commanders. Yeah.
Yeah, Darkland.
They split.
Okay, yeah.
Marbrand, anyway.
Marbrand, that's the one I was forgetting. Okay.
But yeah,
Warrant
they
Marbrand.
split over
Okay.
there. So some stayed with her.
Gotcha.
Anyways, I respect those guys more.
Mm-hmm,
They
me
stayed
too.
with her. Just a bit.
So basically, it's a big deal who you get knighted by. This is an important little point here.
Mm-hmm.
George, in fact, weighs in himself. We've got a direct quote from George. The question posed to George, this is relating to Robb Stark and Olyvar Frey. So, and why did Lord Frey ask Robb to see about Oliver's knighting when he had more than enough anointed knights at his disposal to attend the matter? Meaning Lord Frey had plenty of his own sons who were knights. But George says, why should someone go to Harvard when they can get a degree from their local community college? There is great prestige in receiving your knighthood from a king, a prince, one of the Kingsguard, or other celebrated legendary knights. Getting knighted by a brother is like kissing your sister. We'll leave Jaime Lannister and the Targaryens out of that. And getting dubbed by the local hedge knight is like graduating from barber college. You get a sheepskin maybe, but don't try applying to law school. So that's really neat. That's just quite a George really lays it out there, doesn't he?
It's funny though too when you think about that quote in the context of characters like Sir Dunk, who likely wasn't knighted until much later after claiming to be a knight for a long period of time. But then you have also other characters like Sir Gregor Clegane, who was knighted by Rhaegar Targaryen. And this is a big deal. But like as we were talking about, like earlier on, and my point about A Song of Ice and Fire, a big part about it is that it's not necessarily like who knights you as opposed to the deeds you do after you're knighted. So you could be the lowliest, shittiest hedge knight, but you're doing the good deeds that Duncan does, that Dunk does, then you're good. But you can also be Sir Gregor Clegane, knighted by the Crown Prince of Westeros, and you could be the shittiest knight possible. So I find like I know exactly what George is talking about, and he's making a really good point about what's so special about a character being who's actually knighting you. But at the same time, I also want to be like to a lot of these folks in Westeros, which I can't reach across the pages and talk to them, but I want to be like, it's not about who knights you, it's not about your lineage in terms of your knightly virtues, and it's more about your actual knightly virtues that you're exhibiting as a knight. That's what makes you important. Are there no true knights among you, as Duncan will say in the hedge knight?
So speaking of that, we have Barristan getting his white cloak directly from the king, Jaehaerys II, and he says his vows before the White Bull. Side note, I bet that guy Squire Dalbridge was there. Speaking of people who never advanced beyond Squire, he was Jaehaerys II's squire. So hey, he could have weighed in on this, but alas, it's too late. Now, there's a couple other maybe events that are relevant to this. Barristan's being involved at Duskendale is interesting, and there's another event. He won a melee at Maidenpool, which is, hey, Criston Cole won a melee at Maidenpool, a famous melee at Maidenpool. That's the one, I think, unless I'm getting mixed up, where he the event with the Valyrian steel sword, where he's wielding Dark Sister versus Criston's Morningstar. Now that's interesting too, because in the artwork of Meleys the Monstrous fighting Barristan, the official artwork in the World of Ice and Fire, Barristan's wielding a sword, and Meleys is wielding a Morningstar, and Daemon Targaryen was king of the Stepstones, and Meleys Targaryen was king of the Stepstones. And this is both, these are the two, this is what put these guys on the map. When Criston Cole won that tournament and beat Daemon, that's one of the most early events in his life that made him famous. Not nearly as famous as Barristan here, killing Meleys in a real battle. Although if Daemon was wielding Dark Sister, that was real enough too. But clearly Barristan cutting his way through the Golden Company and killing Meleys is more impressive. But still, it's got a lot of similarities, at least in tone there. Would you agree, or am I stretching there a bit?
No, I love it. I think that's something I never picked up before, but I love it a lot about that similarities. And I love that piece of artwork too. That's from the World of Ice and Fire, of Barristan on the Stepstones killing the two-headed Meleys the Monstrous. That's one of my. I think that's actually my favorite piece from the World of Ice and Fire, which is a lot of lovely art in it throughout. But that's definitely my favorite.
Right on. So side question here. I asked this one to Stephen Atwell when we did our coverage of the War of Ninepenny Kings. What kind of helmet would Meleys the Monstrous wear? Because in that art, he's not wearing one at all, which maybe that's how it would go. Maybe that's why he was killed. It's like, this dude went into battle without a helmet. What is he on HBO or something?
Right, yeah, he might as well. Yeah, that's that trope from TV tropes. Helmets are hardly heroic is the TV tropes trope that goes for it. But yeah, of course, Meleys is not hardly heroic at all. It's hardly heroic at all. So, yeah, I've never even thought of that question before. Probably didn't wear a helmet at all, because there's probably like he was the Golden Company armor is just I can't do this, man. Like you can just don't get hit in the head. That's the important thing I want to tell you as you're going into battle. Well, too bad for him.
It's a good thing he's tall. It helps. So the thing about Duskendale, though, I kind of skipped over that. Duskendale having, being this big moment of his that defines him, as he thinks about it as, did I do right? It was this moment that people laud me for, but was it really a good deed? Because Aerys, rescuing Aerys, that wasn't good, was it? And you wonder if that's part of, wrapped up in the possibility of why he might leave Daenerys, if she starts to show signs of being like her father at all. That's a big reason for Barristan to have second thoughts. Would you agree with that?
It's a huge part of it. I think Barristan in A Dance with Dragons is haunted by this guilt that he feels over his conduct as a Kingsguard knight under Aerys II, of defending a truly monstrous and bad king for Westeros. But he, at the time, as he tries to rationalize, as he's thinking back to it, he's thinking about it in terms of, I had my honor and my vows. And my vows said I had to follow the king. I had to do what the king said. And that is kind of bad about how you prioritize your vows. I mean, as Jamie is going to talk about at the end of A Clash of Kings, like vows and vows, they make you swear and swear. Defend your father, love your family, defend the king. But what if the king is mad? What if your father is bad? So all of these things are coming into focus, and this is why Barristan is such a fascinating character, especially as he becomes a point of view, because he is thinking about things like Duskendale, and he's thinking, was it the right thing? And he thinks about this in terms of Rhaegar, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But he thinks about whether it would have been better if he had let Aerys die and let Rhaegar ascend the throne. Would that have actually led to a forestallance of the war of Robert's Rebellion? I mean, maybe, possibly, potentially. Yeah. But at the same, it's kind of way up in the air. I think we'll find out more in the Winds of Winter for sure. But I think Barristan is consistently haunted by this idea that he was trying to do the right thing so hard during the defiance of Duskendale, and it ends up being the wrong choice, because if Aerys had died, perhaps Robert's Rebellion doesn't happen, and Rhaegar definitely ascends the throne. Barristan with Daenerys, though, is interesting, because by the end of A Dance with Dragons, my sense from Barristan's storyline is that he is looking at Dany, and he's seeing her as this ideal figure to be the Queen of Westeros. As he talks about Dany at the end of A Storm of Swords, he says, "You do not have the taint of madness in you. That's why I'm assuming that you are going to be a just and good Queen of Westeros." You are doing good by the people that you are leading. You are seemingly the best suited person for the kingship, or the queenship rather, of Westeros. So that's why I'm supporting you, and that's why I've come from Westeros. But what happens in the Winds of Winter when Dany comes back leading a Dothraki horde? What happens when Dany is there saying that she is the prophesied Messiah figure and is the reborn Azor Ahai figure if she ends up taking on R'hllor? What if she starts identifying her champion as fire, something that Aerys Targaryen does and Barristan is witness to? These are things that are likely going to be leading to some significant doubts in Barristan's mind about whether he is actually supporting the rightful queen. And as much as objectively, I don't think that Daenerys Targaryen will be mad or going mad at any point in the story necessarily, I do think that a lot of people around her are going to assume that she's going mad. And we already start to see some of that in A Dance with Dragons with various characters such as Sellswords, Tyrion, other characters as well, who are saying, well, she may actually be mad. When we know, because we're inside her head, that she's not necessarily mad. What is Barristan's perspective of Dany going to be when she returns from the Dothraki Sea? He might start to see shades of Aerys in her, and that's a little bit troubling. But we can talk about that a little bit for sure.
Yeah, I think this is important, and we need to wrap another character into this discussion because he's a huge part of this. Varys. Barristan is not a fan of Varys. He blames the beginning of the rot on Aerys' Aerys' reign to Varys. Now, I don't think I need to tell you all that this is not accurate. I mean, Aerys was clearly terrible before this, but it gives you an insight into what Barristan thinks about some of the other things Aerys did wrong before. Apparently, Barristan wasn't terribly bothered by that, which is maybe a whole nother topic and not one that looks well on Barristan. But the idea that it seems more like the Aerys is already on a downward trend. Duskendale made it a lot worse because it's pretty clear that Aerys really hated his experience there, and it messed with him a lot. So I would argue that Varys maybe pushed Aerys more into paranoia, but the groundwork was clearly there already. And this is more of that what you were referring to earlier about the blaming counselors for things rather than blaming the person who's actually in charge. And it's a big part of where Barristan's loyalties might go later, because if Barristan finds out, there's two ways this could go, I think, two major ways this could go, with a lot of, sub-versions of this could happen. But if Barristan finds out Varys is the one that's been backing him and putting him with Dany, he's not gonna like that at all. He's gonna he's like, wait, Varys arranged for this? Wait a second. On the other hand, Varys has more to do with young Griff than he does with Dany. So if Varys, that's kind of an argument for him switching sides, but also against it. So it really depends on what he knows. If he's like John Connington and just gets fed the wrong information and believes Aegon is truly Rhaegar's son, well, that brings another character we need to wrap into this, Rhaegar. So Varys and Rhaegar, the interplay between these two and what Barristan thinks of those two and their influence and their honor, that's a big deal. Because if he really thinks that's Rhaegar's kid, he might want to support him. But if he sees Varys' hand behind this, well, that's a big turnoff. So I don't know how we put all this together, but I think these are both really important elements to consider.
I think it's interesting because, like, we're talking about Varys and his role. It's very interesting because for the longest time I had this belief that Varys was the one that steered Barristan to Illyrio in Pentos and got him over there. And I thought that was actually in the books. Turns out it's not in the books. It's not. We don't actually have evidence of that. But Barristan somehow ends up in Illyrio's manse at the start of A Clash of Kings after he flees King's Landing after witnessing Ned Stark's death. So that's interesting. And I think we'll have to discuss that a little bit more as we're progressing forward. But I think like the other aspect about Barristan is that, in contrast to Aerys, he's a big fan of Rhaegar Targaryen, seemingly, right? He's the guy that's consistently looking at Rhaegar and seeing the clear distinction between him and his father. And that's kind of unique and fascinating when you come up with the idea and come into the idea that Barristan is going to find out about that Rhaegar's son is alive. So how is that actually going to go down? What's Barristan's what do you imagine is going to be Barristan's thought process as he encounters this idea that Rhaegar's son is alive?
Boy, that's going to be difficult. And like you said, he liked Rhaegar a lot, and because he's envisioning Dany as this kind of perfect queen/princess, and he finds out that that's literally how they raised young Griff to be that exact thing. He might buy into this and think, oh, they really did raise him well. He's like, wow, Rhaegar's kid raised well. The problem is, will he agree that he's raised well if Varys and Illyria had such a hand in it? I don't know what Barristan thinks of Jon Connington. That's not an opinion that we've seen either way. I don't think Jon Connington has had any thought about Barristan Selmy, and I don't recall Selmy thinking about Jon Connington. I don't think he knows Jon Connington is alive even. So...
Right.
So that's a missing piece here, but it's such a big deal. I think he's going to be very torn. I think he's going to want to feel a lot of pull to switch to Rhaegar's son. And you mentioned Varys' role in all this from a different angle, and here's something else I should bring out. What does Barristan think about the fact that it was Varys who suggested that they let Barristan go? It was Varys' suggestion to Joffrey and Cersei to let him go. Of course, Varys had his own reason there. He wanted Barristan for himself. But Barristan's not going to see it that way. Barristan's going to see it as like, look at this guy suggesting Kingsguard are removed. That just sounds really dirty and dishonorable to him. But of course, Varys' angle on this is to set him up with either young Griff or Daenerys. And yet, there's another element that's a big problem here. The Golden Company. Is there bad blood between the Golden Company and Barristan Selmy? I mean, he killed their captain general. Aren't they supposed to care about that? Or is it because it's been, 40 years? Maybe they're over it? What do you think about that?
I mean, I got to pull this quote up from our episode we did on Barristan. But I mean, there was this idea from Tyrion's his 6th chapter in A Dance of Dragons, where Tyrion has this dream, right? And the dream goes like this. And this is interesting. So to kind of back this up a little bit, is that Tyrion, in the original reading of this chapter from when George was reading it back in 2005, this quote was not actually in it. It's not recorded in any of the recountings that were done there. So the dream that Tyrion has is that night, Tyrion Lannister dreamed of a battle that turned the hills of Westeros as red as blood. He was in the midst of it, dealing death with an axe as big as he was, fighting side by side with Barristan the Bold and Bittersteel as dragons wheeled across the sky above them. So is that maybe indicating that Tyrion is seeing the potential that Barristan and the Golden Company could align? Is that a prophetic dream at some level? Or is that just more like Tyrion just kind of incorporating some of the information he's learned from Illyrio in his journeys to the Rhoyne, and then just kind of that making himself out to be kind of this weird, psychotic, trippy dream that Tyrion is having? I don't know. I think you bring up a great point that Barristan may not necessarily be interested in joining up with someone who's backed by the Golden Company. But then at the same time, what if it's Rhaegar's son? And then we have the example of Criston Cole, right, who's talking about the Andal tradition that the son is for the daughter. So all of these things, in my mind, this is why I love George R. R. Martin's work more than anything else, is that George derives his characters to their breaking point with the amount of conflict and the amount of different sides and determinations they have to make based on conflicting evidence that both appeals on like an objective level, but also appeals to the personal individual person of Barristan Selmy. Will he back someone backed by the Golden Company? Well, he's also Rhaegar's son, right? No, but I mean, right. And, that it all drives to that ultimate conflict between the characters, but internally, ultimately, is what George is driving at for Barristan. So it's tough, man. It's really tough.
Yeah, there's no like certain answer here by any means. There's, like you say, that's Barristan fighting alongside Bittersteel, and Tyrion having 2 heads. Hello, Maelys the Monstrous vibes. And that seems weird to have Tyrion interspersed in that, because why would Tyrion be on that side of things? So maybe it's suggesting the Golden Company sides with Dany after Aegon is set aside, but that would be kind of weird too. Why would they do that? I mean, I guess I could see that if their only dragon claimant dies, they would be like, well, let's back this other dragon claimant. And
a dragon is still a dragon, right? Is what Illyrio claims. But...
Yeah. Now, there's another potential piece of bad blood here. Barristan kills Simon Toyne, and there's Toynes in the the Golden Company too. So there's not just Maelys and these other things, but yeah, I don't know. That kind of thing might be set aside given these much larger, more important political considerations and personal things. But bad blood is people don't forget about that, and I got to figure at least a few members of the Golden Company are old enough to have been around then. Probably not very many though, but they may be too few to make much difference. But I can't help but think about that and how that might be relevant. So you had backing up a little bit, since we're trying to wrap all these guys together. We got Varys, we got Rhaegar, we got what Barristan believes, what he's going to be led to believe. Now, speaking of what they're led to believe, and what backing up to Barristan's thoughts on Varys and his thoughts on Duskendale, which, by the way, Criston Cole, his brief time as a commander included going through Duskendale, so that's a nice little slight parallel with dragons and stuff. So yeah, what do you think about this? You took a quote from the So Spake Martin about George and Barristan, and that's a good spot for us to go next.
Yeah, so George in 2001, so this is a number of years before he decides to make Barristan a point of view character. As we know, George makes Barristan a point of view character in 2010 when he's writing A Dance with Dragons. So someone asked George whether Barristan, for his personality and for being a member of the Kingsguard and for keeping the king's secrets, is he a good witness about Varys' influence over Varys? And George says, probably stroking his beard, of course, a witness, certainly. A good witness? Well, there were things he was not privy to. And of course, he saw events from his own standpoint. Mm-hmm. So the idea here is that Barristan's relationship to Varys and his knowledge of what Varys is up to is shaded a little bit. You kind of get the impression that Barristan wasn't necessarily privy to all of the worst things that Aerys II did, especially after he went on campaign with Rhaegar. He obviously doesn't know about the wildfire plot to blow up King's Landing. That's something only Jaime knows, and Jaime's the sole witness of at this point. But he is a witness to a number of things that are going on with Aerys II Targaryen. And just to talk about a little bit of some of these things. So we do know, for instance, that, Duskendale is a big part of what is animating Barristan's guilt over Aerys II. But he also kind of like layers his guilt with his kind of ambiguity, right? As we're talking about Aerys and Barristan, he says he stood, saw, and did nothing. And what exactly is he referring to? Well, we never actually learned besides Duskendale. But we know he was almost certainly present when Aerys II burned Lord Rickard Stark to death while having Brandon slaughtered. I think it's mentioned that all of the Kingsguard Knights are present there, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm,
and I wouldn't be surprised if Barristan also stood a door guard when Aerys raped his wife Rhaella. So yeah. Barristan tends to shroud a lot of these things in ambiguities and just kind of like, there were bad things that were happening, but I'm not going to think specifically about those specific bad things that were occurring at the same time. And I think that's an interesting part about Barristan as a character, right? And this is something we talked about at the beginning of this episode, about how Jaime kind of gets a little bit of a heel turn, and that we understand him and sympathize with him early on, later on after we get introduced to his point of view chapters. And it's a little bit different for Barristan when he becomes introduced as a point of view character. Do you feel like that Barristan became a little bit less white, less like shiny white and more gray as he became a point of view character to Dance with Dragons? Or do you feel like more like connected to this guy and feel more sympathy for him?
I feel more sympathy for him and more connected to him, and I think he's more gray. But I think that's part of it because we're all gray on some level. I mean, we're not all dark gray. There's varying shades of gray, and I certainly don't think Barristan's a bad guy. So I can understand the humanity and difficulty, like just all these things we're laying out that haven't even come for him yet. But the things that have come for him, like thinking about him just agonizing over Duskendale, I sympathize with that. Like, what is he supposed to do there?
Right.
And I sympathize with his things we talked about before about how his talent really determined his life arc. And it's like someone that was just pretty good at fighting, rather than incredible, like generationally skilled, would lead a much more normal life that would have much less pressure on him to have to be something that you wouldn't expect a middling warrior to ever live up to these things. But Barristan Selmy, you have these expectations for, and he knows that. He's not, the knightly code of honor kind of fosters getting the most out of yourself as possible and being your best. So yeah, I think that's really difficult. But so it does humanize him, but it also, humanizing people includes accepting their flaws and understanding their flaws and maybe deciding, well, these flaws are too much for me and I don't like this guy anymore. But that did not happen with me and Barristan. When I saw inside his head, I was surprised to get his POVs, but but I think that's
I think it's a really great point. I mean, you brought about how like you get inside somebody's point of view and they become more gray, but also more humanized at the same time. I think that's something that we should be taking when we're encountering these point of views in A Song of Ice and Fire, and then we're inside their head, and they might be really terrible people like Theon or Victarion, Aeron Damphair to a little bit of a lesser extent. Barristan Selmy seems to be this guy that's seemingly really good, but when we get his point of view, he becomes very much human. He becomes less of this kind of figure that kind of exists in Dany's storyline and a figure in his own right. And when we start to encounter him as a human being, there's something there's lots of layers that George has for Barristan, which makes him great, and I really enjoy his perspectives in A Dance with Dragons for sure.
Yeah, right on. So let's see here. Moving on a little bit. A couple of comments before we move on. Matt Reese says, "What if Barristan learns about R plus L equals J and heads north, leaving young Griff and Dany to have their dance?" Well, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, he might think that if he goes just like, geez, another one? What am I, God, am I supposed to go follow Jon Snow now? Like, what the hell, man? Like, I think his head would explode at that point.
He's like, I quit. I'm done.
He'll sprout a second head like Melee's and be like, you decide, second head. And, do you have any thoughts on that, or is that just too hard to consider?
I think it's like I think it's similar to the kind of question like, what if John Connington finds out about R plus L equals J? Will he then like abandon young Griff? And I can see where there's value in that storytelling. I just I don't know. I feel like I say this a lot, but how are you going to fit that storyline amidst all the other storylines that George has to wrap up in just 2 books? As George has been very clear, there's only going to be 2 more books before he gets to the end of the series. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think it'd be interesting, but I'm more content thinking that John Connington and Barristan will die before learning about R plus L equals J, but we'll have to see, I guess. I think that John Connington will likely die knowing that young Griff is not actually Rhaegar's son. I think that's important for his narrative, but him finding about R plus L equals J, on the other hand, to like kind of add on to that, would be just a lot for the narrative to kind of take on.
Bex, yeah, I think I agree with you there. I think that's probably what's going to happen is his arc, his life will be resolved before R plus L equals J comes onto the scene.
It would
as
still
a
be
major
extra
factor.
Painful for him.
It would, yeah, no doubt, yeah.
He learned that. He was like, I was like, supporting the wrong kid. And his name is John?
Yeah, right.
Can you imagine if he does learn that Rhaegar's son's name is John? He would have no idea it was after Jon Arryn. He would truly think it was after himself, I think.
Of course, yeah. Rhaegar's honoring me at long last by naming... But then someone will be like, hey, actually, the Snowspike Martin says that Jon Snow was named after Jon Arryn. I'm going to be like, oh, man,
dang it. And that name didn't come from Rhaegar anyway.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Remember when he was born, so... Otaka Blackfire sends a super chat and says, as long as someone gives Barristan a wooden staff, Victarion has no chance. Oh, man. Good point. That staff scene is so good. We just went through that one in our reread. That's good stuff.
Nice.
So you have some other thoughts about Rhaegar here, too, because coming back to Duskendale a little bit, that's a particular thought about his guilt, is that if he had allowed Aerys to die by not performing this incredible feat of valor, which would be understandable if he hadn't performed this unbelievable commando raid, people would like, hey, Barristan, why didn't you perform this amazing commando raid to rescue Aerys? That would never have happened. Aerys would have been killed, and then Rhaegar becomes king, which is kind of what Tywin wanted. And you almost think, man, do we have to agree with Tywin here? But Barristan's having that same thought. Not directly, maybe Tywin was right, but maybe it would have been better if he had just been like, I got nothing. We got to see what happens here. And that might be part of his undoing the past. The same kind of thing John Connington's trying to do is fix his mistakes from before. So you could really see this being another thing pulling him in the direction of, the Rhaegar's son. I can do it right this time. Yeah. So, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking it's fascinating to me that Barristan, when he comes to Dany's service at the end of A Clash of Kings and on into A Storm of Swords, what he's constantly seeming to evaluate Dany on is whether she is actually Rhaegar's sister or Aerys' daughter. And those seem to be the 2 precepts in his mind that determine whether you're good or you're bad.
Yeah.
And for Barristan, he is a really big Rhaegar fanboy with an I at the end of it instead of a Y. I mean, just like think about like in terms of like in contrast to Barristan's vague but negative memories of Aerys, like, he did a lot of bad stuff, but I'm not going to focus on what exactly he did bad. He has very fond memories of Aerys' son, Rhaegar. I mean, he admires him. When Dany asks him to tell him all the deeds that Rhaegar did, or rather, she's asking about one day, you must tell me all about her father. And then Barristan says, there is, your grace, of good things about him and those who came before him, your grandfather Jaehaerys and his brother, and their father Aegon, your mother and Rhaegar, him most of all. So that's interesting, is that Barristan seems to admire Rhaegar and put him on a pedestal above all the other Targaryens that he's encountered in his tenure as a Kingsguard. And then back when he was posing as Arstan Whitebeard, Barristan said this about Rhaegar. He says that Rhaegar is able, that above all, determined, deliberate, dutiful, single-minded. So it's very clear that Barristan has idealized Rhaegar. And I think there's a little bit of this kind of nostalgia at work in Barristan as he's reflecting back on Rhaegar, because Rhaegar has a lot of greatness and ambiguities attached to him as well, and Barristan does think about those in his dance chapters. And then as finally, as we would talk about Duskendale and why Barristan is so kind of torn up and conflicted about Duskendale, he's thinking about it in terms of Rhaegar. So he says this in the Queensguard chapter from A Dance of Dragons. If he had not gone into Duskendale to rescue Aerys from Lord Darkland's dungeons, the king might well have died there as Tywin Lannister sacked the town. Prince Rhaegar would have ascended the Iron Throne, mayhaps to heal the realm. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. Mayhaps to heal the realm. Not sure that necessarily Rhaegar's ascension would have led to the healing of Westeros, but I do understand his perspective, and I do think that is flavored very strongly with that element of nostalgia, which is very strong for Barristan. If only he hadn't done his one good deed, then Rhaegar would have ascended to the Iron Throne, and Westeros would have never fallen into war. All of the kingdoms wouldn't have rebelled against Aerys, and Barristan could have kept his honor and actually served a good king. And that's consistently what Barristan is after. He is after serving a good king. He is tired of serving kings that are shitty, but he feels like he has to serve because he has made vows to that effect. He wants to serve Daenerys primarily because he views her initially in Storm and The Dance with Dragons as Rhaegar's sister as opposed to Aerys' daughter. And he also makes that thing about the coin flip, right? When the gods toss a coin, you can land either on madness or sanity. I'm screwing up the quote a little bit, but that is essentially what Barristan's looking for. He's tired of serving because he has to. He wants to serve because he wants to. And I think that's a good motivation on Barristan, but it might change about his conception of Dany when she returns in The Winds of Winter, and whether she might resemble more of Aerys' daughter as opposed to Rhaegar's sister. I think that's the determination that Barristan is likely going to make when she encounters him again come The Winds of Winter.
Right on. Well said. So I think we're done with the Barristan, Rhaegar, Aerys stuff. I think there's always more that could be said, but we're starting to run. We're pretty low on time. We won't have time for the Barristan Serwyn stuff, but we should at least cover some of this other stuff. The main bit being, I think, Barristan's time as Kingbreaker, because that's a really big, important part of the comparison in the first place. So let's unfortunately skip past our Barristan under Robert stuff, which is fun, but maybe less relevant to the connections and parallels. It's just there's a few things in there, but time is as it is. We got to do what we got to do. So let's move on to that. Oh, we've got another super chat here. Josh Davis from Australia, still just sending some money while I still can. Oh, well, thank you, Josh. We appreciate that. Yeah, I hope things stay stable for everybody. Barristan the Kingbreaker. With Dany gone, Barristan assumes an uncomfortable position as not being part of Hizdar's Kingsguard, part of the court, not something he's familiar with. He prefers swords and not spies. And this is not unlike Criston Cole being hand to the king while Aegon II is absent because he's badly wounded and no one knows where he is, which is very similar to Dany. No one knows where Dany is. At this part, they assume she's somewhere out on the Dothraki Sea or dead, and that is accurate. So what do you think of let's talk about Barristan the Kingbreaker.
So it's interesting. Barristan, when he actually comes into his own Dance of Dragons, his chapters start after Dany's departure at Daznak's pit. So it's always fascinating to me that George ended up structuring it this way so that we have Barristan operating without a queen or a king to serve. Although Hizdahr keeps Barristan around because at some level, I think he knows Barristan's quality as a warrior, even though he has his own guards that surround him, former pit fighters primarily. But that leads to Barristan being recruited by Skahaz Mokandak into the coup to unseat Hizdahr, and then he convinces Barristan through a variety of means that it was Hizdahr who tried to poison Dany, which is the event that happened back at Daznak's pit, and this leads to Barristan then joining in with the coup in order to unseat Hizdahr's Oloric. And then at the same time, all this is going on, tensions between Yunkai and Meereen are rising, and Barristan is a witness to Bloodbeard, who's a great super minor character in the Dance with Dragons showing up. And Bloodbeard shows up, tosses the head of his friend Grolio at Hizdahr's feet. If you guys remember from Clash, it was Grolio who had transported Barristan and Strong Belwas to Karth and then on to Slaver's Bay there afterwards. And so they had some sort of friendship between the two of them. But the Yunkish kill him, and this leads to increased tensions, and they also demand the dragons be destroyed, the last two that are in Meereen. So then there afterwards, Barristan launches a coup alongside of Skahaz Mokandak, and then unseats Hisdar, then kills Kraz in one of those famous moments from The Song of Ice and Fire, one of those famous duels, which, kind of similar to Criston Cole. Criston Cole had a number of famous duels as well.
Yeah.
Ended up killing a bunch of important people. But then the dragons are released by Quentyn, the Sons of the Harpy, and they rise up. And then the Sons of the Harpy then rise up against Dany's people in Meereen. And then that leads them to Dance of Dragons closes with Yunkai flinging corpses to Meereen and Barriss preparing to fight the Yunkish coalition outside the city walls. So this is fascinating to me in that Barristan was never groomed to be in political leadership. He had always wanted for his entire life to be a Kingsguard knight, to live by the sword and to live honorably by the sword. But now he's being thrust into an uncomfortable role as being Dany's hand in her absence. And I think that's an interesting take, because I think it's similar to Criston Cole. He assumes the handship for a brief time under Aegon II, right? Or am I wrong about that?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Is it Barristan assumes Criston Cole assumes a brief handship under Aegon II. Is that true, or am I?
Yes, he does. He's hand. He's named Hand, and dies as Hand. Yeah.
So I mean, I think the comparisons are all there for these two characters, and it's fun. I think Barristan is a unique and interesting character, and Criston Cole is a unique and interesting character. I think that they both inform each other about what it means to be a Kingsguard knight and what it means to serve some regions who are maybe not for the best, or maybe will not turn out to be the best in terms of Barristan and Dany's relationship. As the Dance with Dragons closes and the Winds of Winter starts off, Barristan is about to fight on Dany's behalf. But I do kind of wonder, will Barristan come out of winning the Battle of Fire and maybe regret his decisions as he starts to encounter that Dany, who the type of character that Dany's going to be back in the Winds of Winter? I don't know. I'll turn it over to you, because I've kind of droned on a little bit enough. I've droned enough already.
That's really good. I think that there's just so much to the possibilities here. I think we've done a great job today of spelling them all out, but of course we don't have answers. This is because, like you said, George is so good at delivering conflict, and when you have conflict that argues really well for two different possibilities, it's impossible to know for sure. I think the argument that Barristan could just die ignominiously, kind of like he did on TV against the Brazen Beasts or something like that, he could get murdered by what's his name, Skahaz Mokandax, man. He could just go down like that. After all, Skahaz does not really agree with Barristan's methods. And he probably has his own agenda as well. So, in fact, he very likely has an agenda, and it doesn't really include Barristan Selmy. And Barristan is a bit of a target in that sense, because he's not experienced in these whole types of political games. And like you said, he's just trying to work his way into something that he can understand, like try to make it come to a conflict, because that's something he is comfortable with. He's comfortable with the sword in his hand and an enemy in front of him. And if things can be settled that way, he's much happier doing it that way. But will they be settled that way? Maybe partially, but entirely, I kind of doubt that. So
I love that.
Yeah, go ahead.
In Barristan's head, as he's trying to figure out the conspiracy that Ska's presenting to him, and his head starts to hurt, and he's like, I can't even with these people. Like, come on, can we just get back to the stuff that I actually understand, which is sword fighting and stuff like that. I mean, Barristan's not necessarily a dumb jock, although we can see elements of that in his personality. He was not made for politics, but that's interesting when you actually throw him in the mix of these people who were made for politics. People like Skahaz Mokandak, who seems very adept at playing the Marinese Game of Thrones. And likely in the Winds of Winter, Barristan is going to be exposed once again to a character by the name of Tyrion Lannister. You might have heard of him. He's in The Song of Ice and Fire, I've heard once or twice.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, but this guy is coming to Dany's side, and he has a vital piece of information that no one else in Slaver's Bay and no one else in Dany's side possibly knows, with the exception of potentially Makoro, who's seen it in the fires in his dreams. That is that there is a character that is claimed to be Aegon the Sixth Targaryen, and I do wonder what that is going to look like come the Winds of Winter, when Tyrion is going to intersect with Dany, something that George has confirmed will happen in the Winds of Winter at some level. We don't know exactly how exactly it's going to pan out. But what is that going to mean if Barristan is there in council session and he hears from Tyrion Lannister about Aegon the Sixth Targaryen being alive? Will he believe that this is actually Aegon the Sixth? Will maybe Tyrion spin it to be that this is actually not Rhaegar's son? It's actually a Blackfire pretender or an imposter operating in it. I mean, Tyrion seems to indicate at some levels in A Dance of Dragons that he doesn't necessarily believe that young Griff is Aegon the Sixth, although that's a little bit ambiguous. But what is actually going to be Barristan's take when he hears this information from Tyrion Lannister? Because again, I think this is going to be a big part of why these two characters intersect and what their conversation is going to be about. I think it's going to be the means by which Tyrion worms his way into Dany's side, but it's also going to have impacts and ramifications for the characters that are surrounding Dany, from Jorah Mormont, who could be there, to especially Barristan Selmy for sure.
That's a great point, because you wonder how some of these secondary characters will influence the decisions of someone like Barristan, not calling it, well, Tyrion maybe isn't a secondary character, but the way he tells this story to Barristan, he's very convincing, very cunning. He could maybe get Barristan to think a certain way that if someone else brought this information to Barristan, it might go differently. But Tyrion is extremely good at understanding perspective and which information to hold back and which information to tell to get people to do what he wants. He's obviously just great with his talking. And so, yeah, but that also, if we pair that up against a comparison to someone, say, like Jon Connington, well, what if Barristan meets Jon Connington somehow and then hears his side of things? And yeah, like, what will Tyrion tell? Will he tell Barristan his suspicions? Like, I don't think that's Rhaegar's kid, because that would be a huge deal to Barristan to think, to put some doubt. You know, if Barristan jumps ship because he thinks that's Rhaegar's kid, well, what if there's doubt? What if Tyrion sows the seed of doubt there? What if Varys and Illyrio's ability to co-opt symbols to give the realm the idea that this is truly Rhaegar's son is successful? Like, what if he has Darkstar wielding Dawn at his side, just like Arthur Dayne was at Rhaegar's side with Dawn? That would just scream legitimacy. And what if he has Blackfire? I mean, come on, that's going to be just so powerful as a symbol. People are going to just flock to his banners, and Barristan might be one of them. But if Tyrion undermines that, this is so hard to see which story Barristan will believe, if he even hears multiple stories. Yeah. So, boy, you're right. It's tricky. What we can do is we answer questions, but we probably create more questions than we answer.
Yeah, right. It's so complex. I feel like that a lot of these themes and these storylines, they feel kind of secondary to the plot of Jon and Dany and Tyrion. But I don't feel that way. I think that George has done a fantastic job of interweaving all of these, the conflicts the various characters like Barristan are facing, that Jon Connington are facing, that Arianne Martell is facing. And those kind of impact the main storylines and become integral to those main storylines, or so-called main storylines. And I think that's important when we're talking about, and we're probably getting to the close of this episode, is that we have this concept that there are no unimportant storylines in A Song of Ice and Fire. Except maybe Aerys Oakheart, but even his is a little bit important. And Barristan.
I mean, just to cut in, I just have to say that you just shows that they're all part of the same story.
Yeah,
they're all the same storyline. Ultimately, when it's all said and done, they all contribute to it. They're all part of the song.
Yeah, that's a good point. Aerys Oakheart is like Barristan as a young man. I think of him like very similarly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you guys were comparing him to Criston too, obviously.
Yeah, I mean that's the title of the chapter.
Like you mentioned that, but yes, like he's important.
He is
very not as much, but yeah, he is.
Least important doesn't mean unimportant.
Yeah, I mean these characters are important. I think that also like feeds back into the history part of it too, and that there is no unimportant history. It's all feeding the main story, and the main story is feeding the history. George does a really fantastic job of creating character archetypes in the history of the World of Ice and Fire and in Fire, especially in Fire and Blood Volume 1, that inform the modern context of the 5 main books. We've got characters that are representing people from like Tyrion. You know, we've got characters like Criston Cole that are archetypes for Barristan. We've got so much of these elements that are really, really helping to inform the main story. And I'm just trying to pull up a quote here as I try and stall for time from Fire and Blood. Yeah,
I know that trick.
I'm riffing, yeah. Because there's a great quote. And I just finally find it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
There's a great quote from Fire and Blood, which talks about Aegon II and what he's going to be, and why a character like Criston Cole might be attracted to him and ended up backing him. Even if he had personal reasons, there were also some elements about Aegon II that were important for him. He had the symbols of legitimacy. As the Fire and Blood says, every visible symbol of legitimacy belonged to Aegon. He sat the Iron Throne, he lived in the Red Keep, he wore the Conqueror's crown, wielded the Conqueror's sword, and had been anointed by a septon of the faith before the eyes of tens of thousands. Grand Maester Orwell sat in his councils, and the Lord Commander of the King's Guard had placed the crown upon his princely head, and he was male, which in the eyes of many made him the rightful king, his half-sister the usurper. Well, I mean, isn't that basically the story that's going to unfold in the Windswinter between Daenerys and young Griff right there? Is basically Fire and Blood showing us the type of story that's going to happen? I mean, George has kind of already said what's going to happen between these two Targaryen claimants. And I think that Aegon, in the form of young Griff, is going to have a lot of the symbols of legitimacy. He'll have the faith of the Seven. He'll have the armies. He'll have the backing of many noble lords. And he could potentially have the former Lord Commander of the Kingsguard riding into the rescue and placing the crown upon his head. I think that would be a fitting and beautiful way of symbolizing Aegon's perceived legitimacy, even if he's not actually legitimate.
I totally agree. That's maybe for us to hope for that to specifically happen, maybe too much, but it would fit so well, and I could see that or something like it happening. I honestly didn't consider the possibility of Barristan himself placing the crown on Aegon's head, just like Criston Cole did, but boy, that would fit super well. It would be really synchronous, quite awesome. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think that does it for today. We covered a lot. We didn't quite cover everything we wanted to, but we knew that would happen. That's always the nature of it. I'll come back with this Barristan, Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, Criston Cole thing some other time. We'll figure out a way to present that in the future.
It's really good.
It is cool,
really,
right?
Really yeah.
So we'll at least tease that for y'all. And so, Jeff, please tell everyone again, remind them where to find you guys and what chapters are coming up next. I mean, you're just going in order, so that's pretty easy to see. But still, tell everybody what's. That's true. You're that. Well, yeah, just explain it. I'll just let you speak then.
So, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me on. I feel like that same sort of Barristan sense of nostalgia when we were doing this live cast, because that's, it was like back in 2013. I was still in my 20s at that point, and we did those 3 Battle of Ice episodes, and I can't thank you and Ashayed enough for kind of bringing me into the fandom in a way that kind of expanded beyond Reddit and these different places, and I really appreciate that. And that's you guys will be my lifelong friends for many reasons, but among them being that reason for sure. So thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you as well, man. Thanks for saying that. We appreciate it. And you have earned it all. You're such a huge part of this community. You guys have put out so much amazing stuff, and I get so many inspirations from y'all.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that so much. Yeah, so I mean, broadly speaking, you could find me at Brendan Beefish on Reddit. Probably don't want to follow me. I'm probably have the worst Twitter account in human history, according to some.
I concur.
Probably true. Yeah, Shay will tell you. Don't follow me on Twitter at Brendan Beefish. But I'm also on Reddit as Brendan Beefish as well. And you can email us at the Notacast podcast at notacast@gmail.com. It's usually Emma reads that part, so I had to kind of think about it for a second. So we're doing, as we were saying at the beginning of the episode, we're going chapter by chapter, one week at a time, going through this chapter analysis. And right now we just finished the first part of Catelyn 3, which is the famous parlay scene between Stannis and Renly. We just got to the point where Renly's about to show up. We just got really, it's such a dense chapter, and George does amazing work of doing a lot of the groundwork and foreshadowing that's going to end up animating so much of what's going to happen down in the Stormlands come the Windswinter for sure. And just these 2 chapters, Catelyn 3 and Catelyn 4, as well as Davos 2 later on. But yeah, so that's where I do that. I do that with Emmett, aka Poor Quentin, which is a lot of fun. He's the nice one of the podcast, which is lovely, and the smart one too. So I have both of that going for him.
And he's also the one that's done more Euron cosplay.
Yes.
Which was super important, of course.
What cosplay have you even done, Jeff? Call me when you've done a Blackfish cosplay.
I don't do cosplay.
But if you did, you would do Blackfish, huh?
I don't know who I do. I do Criston Cole. That's who I
do.
Nice. I also would be remiss if I did not mention what a star your daughter is. Lots of people commented. Already got a post in our Facebook group from Amy Landtrip about what a joy it was.
So,
surprise. I'll let them know.
I'll have to say that she's totally beaten you in terms of like getting on the History of Westeros podcast at an earlier age than you. You said you got on in your 20s, but she did it at what?
Yeah.
3? Is she 3?
She is 3, yes. The oldest is 3. I don't know if you saw, but the youngest one came up too. So she was.
I couldn't actually see you guys. I could only hear it.
Yeah, he can't see a thing.
Oh, I should have oriented the camera, but she was down that way.
Well, everyone else can see you.
Everyone else can see. Yeah, I just don't have. I can't see you at all. I have only the document in front of me. But I'll look at I can watch the video later. I'll look. And now I have a good reason to look. If it was just to see you,
I just
see your daughter.
That you didn't actually. It just took me a second to for that to click. That you didn't see daughter.
Right. I heard her, though. I heard that cuteness.
Yeah, you have to look back. She was very interested. She wanted to know who my friends were. And, that's
You
great.
mean your neighbors?
Cool. Well,
My neighbors, right? Neighbors, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for coming. This was awesome, and I thank Shea for all her excellence on handling things, handling the stream, handling all the comments.
They bow and they go, "Your Excellence."
Shea, her excellence. Shea is the bestalence. The best, yeah. It almost sounds like pestilence, which is not the kind of word we're looking for.
Not right
Yeah, I was
now,
about to
at
say.
least. Not in this climate.
Not at all. That's not even funny. Yeah. Okay, so let's say thanks to our patron supporters and everybody else who helped. A lot of you guys sent questions today, comments. Seems like the chat was particularly active. I guess you all particularly like this topic, and so do we. So we were really happy to get to do it. It was super fun. And we'll catch you all next time. We have, of course, our recurring Valeritas every Sunday, game streams Wednesday and Friday for the time being, and the occasional other streams on Tuesdays or Saturdays that we will announce ahead of time when we have them. And don't forget to check out the new Witcher podcast that I'm doing with Kyle Foster and Mikhail Schick. That should have its first episode. It has its trailer episode out as of this moment, so you can at least get a sense of what we're all about. But the first real episode isn't out. It will be out in just a few days. All right. Thanks to our peers of the realm, Lord Stephen Stark, Titles, Hand of the Queen, who is known, Hand of Queen Ashea, who is known as the best. Lord Jim the Fortuitous of Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire is the Warden of the West. Lord George Stormsville the Cunning is Lord of the Chiliad and Warden of the East. Cabethy Unfrozen is Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Defender of the Old Gods and Warden of the North. Lord Brendan Lannister is the Bloodlion, ruler of Castle Everroar and Warden of the South. The mysterious BR is our Hand of the King. Elite from outside the realm include Lord James Tuttle, King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea, Commander of the Royal Fleet, consisting of the Narrow Fleet led by flagship Caraxes, and the Bloodstone Fleet led by flagship Prince Daemon. I suppose he would be on Team Rhaenyra very clearly. He is not a fan of the idea of Barristan switching sides. I think he would prefer to see Barristan. He would sink Barristan's ship if he's heading to Westeros to switch sides. That's what we would see the King of the Stepstones do here. King Beyond the Wall, Sidney Jesse the Fallborn, Lord of Blue Spring in the Haunted Forest, wields a dagger of dragon glass and the Valyrian Steelblade Red Frost. He thinks these guys should come beyond the wall to settle their differences. It's not a real war unless it's fought in ice cold. Lady Sarah Connolly the Willful is wit beyond measure, is man's greatest treasure. Jenny's patron. Well, I finally delivered for you, Jenny's patron. Our small council includes Lord Daniel the Sneaky Russian, Master of Ships, Lord Benjen of House Hornwood, Master of Laws, Lord Fabian Flowers, the Bastard of Greenshield, Master of Coin, Lord Johann of House Orcos, called Shadowhawk, is Master of Whispers. Lady Direliz of Castle Naki is the Alpha Patron. Lord Dan of the Red Mountains and Castle Great Bell is Breaker of the Second Stone. Gregor the Toasty is Lord of the Bread Fort. Lord Ryan of Castle Stonegate is Guardian of the Rocky Mountain Pass. Ashlyn Winter is the Hawk's Eye, Lady of Castle Skyfall. Lady Mikkel of Moonacre is leader of the Werewood Protectorate Alliance. The Lord of the Halls of Castle Hillcrest is wielder of the Valyrian Steel Machete, Everglazed. Lord Alistair Whitaker is Lord of the Dawnhold. Lord Bemmy Snugglebunny is Guardian Ranger of the Hidden 100-Acre Werewood, dual wielder of the Valyrian Short Swords, Glorious Morning and Little Light Wise, sharpshooter of the Werewood and Ironwood Laminated Longbow, Todd Von Oben. When you fear things cannot get worse, Snugglebunny enters the fray.
Great. That's a great name.
The Bastard of the Wolves. Also, that one has taught me to speak better because it's so hard to say. You know, that one just makes you better at speaking, doing that one over and over. So thanks, Lord Bemmy. The Bastard of the Wolfswood, First Forester of the Old Gods, is sworn to House Ironwerewood. Listen for the silence. Lady Liana Kelly of Wolf Island is Protectors of the Steelhold. Casey Stark of House Acres. Lady Kay of House Archer is Lady of Earth Dog, Huntress of the Wolfswood, and Guardian of Maddie Squirrelsbane, the Mighty Direweenie. Lady Raywin of House Dillsdane is the Star Spear. Peter Rivers is the Pale Dragon and heir to Bloodraven. Lady Carlin Carey of Castle Stone Sharp, whose horse is shod in Valyrian steel, is Lady Rider of the Rising Hills. Lady Mora of House Stark is Archmistress of Apothecaries and Woods Witch. Her castle features werewood doors with painted moons. Our King's Justice is Sir Troy the Steady, wielder of the Valyrian steel blade Fate. Our Queenside Council is led by Bloody Ben Blackwood, Master of Whispers. Backed by Rebea Star-Eyes, Lady of Waves and Mistress of Ships, Captain of the Iron Shadow Cat, in the shadows we bear our claws. Katrin of the Wise of House Trondheim is Master Coin. Grand Maester M. Elizabeth is middle daughter of Lady Lyanna Mormont, Lurst Lady to forge both the Silver and Valyrian Steel link. Laura Boros is the Lady of Infinity and Master of Laws. Our Kingsguard includes Lord Miriam, Lord Commander. Sir Glennon of House Leanne is called Lioncloak, longest tenured White Sword. Sir Dean the White is Knight of the Black Star. Sir Jord of House Pepsi is the Beverage Knight. Gregor Snow is called Snow Bear, a bastard of Winterfell. Sir Jen Seaworth is Knight of the Southern Snows, and Lisa is Water Witch of Dorne. Our Red Wedding Band is led by Sir Newt of the Rock, wielding Dwemer Note, a weirwood lute with Valyrian steel strings. That is a fancy instrument. Our Queen's Guard includes Lord Captain Commander Haema Helmont, the Sellsword Sentinel, Alexander of House Atreides from the Seat of Dune, I must not fear, fear is the mind killer. Sir Rambo is Knight of House Gannon, First Blood. Sir Leon of House Walker, wielder of the twin Valyrian steel blades Fire and Ice and the werewood bow Rain. Amber the Adamant is Knight of the Mist and Mother of Squids. The Wintry Wolverine, We Finish What You Begin, and Nora Neko. Then our Beard Guard, Lord Commander George the Golden, heads it up, backed by Sir Joshua Oakhart, the White Oak, Lady Rita of the Coppermane, the Unbound, Dance the Fervor, Sir Jeff Warden of the AC, wielder of Triad, the multifaceted beard of Platinum Red and Brown, Stay Frosty, and Sir Tim Gorgile, Mad Boy of the Western Desert. Now, last but not least, our History of Westeros Night's Watch, which is led by... See, I always do the same thing you say, Jeff. I'm scrolling towards that, so I have to like fill in that space to find it. Lord,
right? Yeah, like yeah,
podcaster's trick. Yeah, babble till you find what you were looking for. Lord Commander Benjen Umber, the Silent Giant, is wielder of the Valyrian Steel Greatsword Winter's Kiss. First Builder Maegor Snow, aka Maegor the Cool, is the Fire and the Snow. First Ranger Sir Sorce Delica is of House Gramercy. And First Steward Jacob Storm, called Steel Spine, is the bastard of, appropriately enough, Blackhaven. All right. So that's it, everybody. Thanks again to Jeff. Thanks again to Ashaya. Thanks to everybody who came live. Thanks to everybody who likes and shares and tells their friends about our podcast or supports us on Patreon. You are the real MVPs. And we will see you next time for more History of Westeros. Valar Rereadus.